Chapter 51. On the beach, Sam studied the three devices. Sam said, Vikings could read and write quite well for the time. They used a non-standardized alphabet called runor, built upon sound values. While there are few remains of runic writing on paper from the Viking era, thousands of stones with runic inscriptions have been found where Vikings lived. Suddy said, And you're hoping this runic stone holds the secret location of Valhalla? That would be nice. Sam drew a breath. Realistically, once these artifacts are on board the Tehila, where they can be photographed and studied properly, we should be able to get a good idea where your Viking ship has traveled. We know it reached some location where the first-century Hellenistic fleet had once existed because of the amphorae we found. Ergo, the navigator must have made a note of it, and hopefully that note is in the runic stone. In all reality, we'll probably find a series of locations along a certain latitude. Then we can backtrack and try and rediscover what they found. Sounds complicated. Not so much complicated as time-consuming. Marine archaeology, you'll find, is an art as much as a science. And then again, sometimes you just have to get lucky. Suddy smiled wistfully. Tell me about the sunstone. What do you want to know? Everything? Sam grinned. I'm not sure I can tell you all that much. Do you know how it worked? Uh-huh. Sam paused, thinking about what he'd read years ago about the unique device. Viking seafarers knew how to use the altitude of the sun at midday and the stars to estimate latitude, which was helpful when sailing to a destination of known latitude. Depth sounding was probably used in the Baltic Sea, but not in the deeper waters of the Atlantic. Viking navigators were close observers of sea and weather conditions. The behavior of seabirds could indicate the presence of land nearby, and cloud formations in an otherwise cloudless sky could suggest land just over the horizon. Sam turned the palms of his hands outward in a gesture resonating the simple fact of life for the Viking seafarers. You must remember that the Vikings were often at the mercy of the weather, and shipwrecks were common. The discoveries of Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland were all made when Viking ships were blown off course during extreme weather conditions. To avoid getting lost on their voyages across the North Atlantic 1,000 years ago, Vikings relied on the sun to determine their heading. This was long before magnetic compasses were available in Europe, by the way. But cloudy days could have sent their ships dangerously off course, especially during the all-day summer sun at those far north latitudes. The Norse sagas mention a mysterious sunstone used for navigation. It is believed that these sunstones could have been calcite crystals, and that Vikings could have used them to get highly accurate compass readings, even when the sun was hidden. That much I kinda know. But how do they work? Sam said, The trick for locating the position of the hidden sun is to detect polarization, the orientation of light waves along their path. Even on a cloudy day, the sky still forms a pattern of concentric rings of polarized light, with the sun at its center. If you have a crystal that depolarizes light, you can determine the location of the rings around the hidden sun. Suddy said, That sounds pretty smart for people going back to the 10th century. Like I said, Vikings were no dummies. Despite what modern TV shows might have us believe about their brutality, they were scholars and highly intelligent people. So what sort of crystal did they use to depolarize the sun? Sam said, Calcite is such a crystal. It has a property called birefringence. What? Birefringence. It basically means that light passing through calcite is split along two paths, forming a double image on the far side. The brightness of the two images, relative to each other, depends on the polarization of the light. By passing light from the sky through calcite and changing the crystal's orientation until the projections of the split beams are equally bright, allowing them to take a sun reading even when cloud cover would otherwise have prevented it. So what? Did they just hold the crystal up against the sky? No, that's where the Uunartok disk comes in, Sam said, holding up the wooden disk they'd found. They used a chunk of calcite from Iceland spar, a rock familiar to the Vikings, and locked it into a wooden device that beams light from the sky onto the crystal through a hole and projects this double image onto a surface for comparison. They then used it over the course of a completely overcast day. They took the measurements from a point on land where they knew the sun's exact trajectory. Sam paused, waiting for any questions. When Sutty simply nodded, he kept going. Like a sundial, a sun compass features a vertical pin. The sun's rays cause the pin to cast a shadow, which is longer in the morning and late afternoon, and shortest at solar high noon. And this shadow is used to create mnemonic lines. The disk is placed in a fixed, level position, and an observer regularly marks the shifting position of the pin tip's shadow across the disk during the course of the day. When these position marks are connected, the result is a west-to-east mnemonic line that comes closest to the vertical pin at high noon. In the northern hemisphere, a straight line drawn from the base of the pin to that closest high noon position will point directly to true north, which will then serve as the compass's north index mark. The mnemonic line will be essentially straight during the vernal and autumnal equinoxes and downward concave at the summer solstice. Sutty stared at the Uunartok disk. There were dozens of small grooves marked into the disk. Any idea what these are? I'd have to look at some charts and find an expert on the subject, but I have a fair guess what they might represent. Well, go on. Don't keep me guessing. All right. One theory is that a Uunartok disk, used in conjunction with a sunstone, allowed the user to determine their latitude as well as compass heading. A number of researchers from the University of Hungary pointed to a series of very short inscribed lines stacked atop one another on the disk's north index mark, whereas mnemonic lines, by necessity, run from west to east across the sun compass's face. Under this theory, the disk's user would have made a reference point at the north index mark at high noon just prior to departure, and then made subsequent high noon marks during the course of the journey, and compared these against their home's reference point. If the journey's marks were in the same position as the home reference point, it meant that the user had been maintaining a consistent latitude. A high noon mark coming in below the home reference meant that one was further south. Sam said, a modern replica showing how a course of northwest by west may have been plotted by the Uunartok disk's user around the time of the summer solstice. The traveler rotates the disk while keeping it level until the vertical mnemonic pin tip's shadow touches the summer solstice mnemonic line, which reveals the direction of true north. The traveler then turns the horizontal directional pin 5 compass points to the west for northwest by west and adjusts course to match the direction of the pin. Sounds amazingly complicated, Sutty said. Now what? Sam thought about it for a moment. He was keen to get his finding back on board the Tehila, where they could be better examined. They might still return to the wreck site with a metal detector, but he doubted it would help him find anything. Certainly nothing as valuable as the sunstone and navigational runestone, which might open the door to Valhalla. Still, there was one thing that he'd like to still see before leaving the area. He said, "I saw a cave at the end of the inlet. I wouldn't mind checking it out." "Sure, what do you expect to find?" "Nothing, to be honest. Some artifacts might have washed ashore, but if they had, and they've been exposed to the elements above water, all evidence of them have probably been destroyed centuries ago." "So why do you want to go there?" Sam shrugged. "No reason, really. I just want to rule out missing something obvious." Chapter 52. Sam motored the Zodiac around the bend and entered the inlet for the third time that day. This time, as he cruised toward the Viking wreck, he didn't slow to a stop. Instead, he kept going, motoring all the way up to the very end of the inlet. His eyes ran across the jagged and vertical cliffs, a mixture of limestone and granite, polished smooth by millions of years of being weather-beaten. At the end of the inlet, he drove the Zodiac onto the rocky beach. He tilted the outboard motor, lifting the propeller out of the water, and the inflatable coasted up onto the shore. Sam and Sutty jumped out and pulled it a few feet farther up, just to be safe. Confident that their ride wasn't going to accidentally get caught in a wave and drift back into the inlet, Sam allowed his eyes to wander, taking in the entire place at a glance. It was a landscape photographer's paradise. The crystal-clear water, white, polished stone beach, leading to limestone and granite cliffs rising majestically from the edge of the shore. The white stone a stark contrast to the deep greens and yellows of the willow trees, aspen, and poplar trees. At the end of the rocky beach, time had eroded two large limestone boulders that leaned in on each other, creating an opening large enough for an adult to walk through, revealing a moderate-sized cave. Sam glanced at Sutty. "Have you ever been inside?" She smiled. "Of course." "Is there anything worth seeing?" She made a mischievous grin. "You'll just have to go see for yourself." Sam suppressed a smile. "Really?" She shrugged. "Sure, why not? There's nothing Viking-related, but I promise you it will be worth your effort." "Okay," Sam said, taking the bait. He walked through the opening, wishing he'd brought a flashlight. The tunnel was roughly 20 feet long and fairly narrow, more like a slot canyon than a cave, before opening up to a large cathedral cavern. He smiled as he stared at the wonder before him. The grotto was vaulted by giant walls of limestone. Millennia of erosion in the soft, porous limestone high above resulted in multiple openings, which allowed beams of sunlight to illuminate the cavern like an array of spotlights. Sam's eyes followed the beams, tracing their origins, before landing on a forest of dark-leafed plants. With the exception of the raised section, where the strange plants grew fiercely, the entire grotto was flooded with a lagoon. The water was still, but Sam guessed in a region with so much porous limestone, it wouldn't take much for the water to seep in during one of Sipawesque Lake's king tides, or even an underground stream. Not that it mattered. His eyes returned to the plants. He wasn't much of a botanist, but he was certain he'd never seen anything like the strange plants in all his veritably wide travels. His eyes narrowed as he studied the plants. There was something almost distinctly Jurassic about their appearance. They had big leaves. They were nearly 6 feet wide, oval-shaped, and a dark seaweed green. At the center of the plant was a single stalk, with what appeared to be the giant bud of an unopened flower. Half a dozen butterflies appeared to be lingering beneath the unopened bud. Like the plants, these looked like they had been beefed up on steroids or something, with the smallest one being at least the size of his fully outstretched hand. They were beautiful to look at, with a purple velvety color on one side of the wings and an almost rainbow prismatic glow on the other. They appeared to be fluttering in the beam of light, warming themselves in the rays. Sam watched one in particular as it landed on an enormous leaf. It stayed still just long enough for him to capture a good quality photo. Not just one, but several photos, all from different angles. Hopefully someone would be able to use it to identify the creature, and possibly the plants as well. The butterfly took off and joined the rest of the group. He stared at them in wonder for a few minutes with rapt pleasure, giving them his undivided and muted attention, captured by their spell. His ocean blue eyes wide, taking in the sight almost reverently. He felt his heart begin to race, as though there was something almost spiritual about them. Sutty was the first to break the silence. "They're called a kaleidoscope." Sam turned to face her, the spell broken. "Sorry, what?" "A group of butterflies. They're called a kaleidoscope." He considered that and smiled. "Good name." Sam brought up the photos he'd taken on his cell phone. He studied the large wings. They were royal purple with a double set of eyes on the back of its wings. Up close, he could just make out the 4 individual images that looked like eyes, but from any distance they looked like a pair of eyes. The double set of eyes gave the butterfly's wings the unique effect that no matter where you were, the eyes appeared to be tracking you, following his movements. He said, "I don't suppose you know their name." "The butterflies?" she asked. He nodded. She shook her head. "No, but they seem to like those plants. Every time I've been here, they always seem to linger in this cavern." "I wonder if anyone's ever studied them," Sam asked, his voice wistful. A shadow of fear crossed Sutty's face. "Actually, it's funny you should mention that." "Why?" 2 years ago, this whole place was cordoned off. There was a big gate, barbed wire fence, the whole lot. Lots of security guards." Sam furrowed his brow. "Did they say why?" "No. And when I tried to ask what was going on, I was told under no uncertain circumstances that I wasn't to ask any more questions." "What did you do?" She bit back a mischievous grin on her parted lips. "I couldn't help myself." "What did you do?" "I assumed someone had finally come to look into the Viking ship." "And?" She clasped her hands together. "I had a look." "How?" "There's a secret tunnel. It's underwater. I dived it and surfaced inside the grotto just over there. I surfaced just for a few seconds and took a peek." Intrigued, Sam asked, "What did you see?" "There were men in protective coveralls. You know, like the sort of PPE you see in those horror movies with the yellow biosecurity symbol on them." Sam frowned. "A trefoil?" "A what?" she asked. "You know, the sign for nuclear radiation?" "No, this was the other one, the biological hazard one." Sam finished it for her, drawing it with his finger in the sand. "With 3 black circles forming a triangular shape, with a single interlapping one at the center, on a bright yellow background?" "That's it," she said. "That's what I saw in their suits." "What were they doing?" "I don't know, but they were taking samples of the plants." Sam stared at the plants and wondered who the hell was coming for it. Sutty said, "There's something else you should know." "What?" "I watched a couple of them remove their biosecurity suits." She paused a beat. Her eyes darted furtively, as though checking that no one else was around the cavern to overhear what she had to say. Then, with a determined voice, she whispered, "They wore military uniforms underneath. I didn't recognize the uniforms at first. I mean, camouflage is camouflage, right? No matter what the country of origin. Right, Sam agreed. Sati said, But then I saw it. Saw what? Sam asked, no longer able to hide his impatience. A flag. It was on the soldier's right upper arm. She expelled a long sigh, as though there was no coming back. The patch bore the image of the flag of the United States of America. Sam shook his head. What the hell were American soldiers doing on Canadian soil, secretly studying ancient plants? Chapter 53. Doug Jones was deeply satisfied. The senator for Minnesota leaned back in his office chair, behind a solid desk made of mahogany, chestnut, and tulip poplar that had been in his family for nearly 2 centuries. Outside his window, the sun was beginning its descent, turning the sky a wash of purple, pink, and blue. It was Friday afternoon, and he was feeling good about the world as he poured himself a glass of Glenfiddich 23, a particularly good year. Some mistakes had been made earlier in the week regarding the whole DARPA fiasco. Decisions were made, hard ones, but the right ones, and the problem seemed to have been dealt with expediently and definitively. Now, to even things up, a bill he'd been working for nearly 2 years finally passed in the Senate. His secretary stepped into his office. "There's a gentleman here to see you, sir." The senator frowned. "Didn't I tell you to clear my afternoon schedule, Mary?" "You did, sir." She waited for him. A coquettish and easily persuasive smile formed on her lips. He knew that smile. It meant she wanted him to hear her out, or give her a favor in something. She was older than him by nearly a decade, but she had even white teeth and ringlets of gray hair that framed an altogether still beautiful and endearing face. She had intensely blue eyes, behind which was a mind as smart as any he'd ever met. He easily imagined that smile had granted her many wishes throughout the years. The edge of his lips curled upward, his momentary hostility naturally segueing toward his default personality of amiability, well practiced after 26 years in office. "I'm sorry, Mary. Who is he?" "The gentleman had an appointment, and I tried to cancel it, but I couldn't reach him, and now he's turned up. I feel bad to send him away. He said he wouldn't take more than about 10 minutes of your valuable time." She paused a beat, and then, knowing that the men and women of the military held a special place in his heart, she said, "He's from the Army, retired, but I thought you might make an exception for him." The senator nodded. He glanced at his wristwatch. His wife was hosting a party in his honor for succeeding in passing the bill, but he had time. "Sure, send him in." "Thank you, sir." She stepped out of his office and returned 30 seconds later with the gentleman. The senator stood up out of respect, his eyes appraising the man in a split second with the capability of a seasoned politician who needed to place everyone with precision, as a potential donor, rival, problem, or vote. This man was clearly military or ex-military. He was short, yet somehow looked large. His posture ramrod straight, his physique filled with muscles. The stranger handed the senator's secretary a red pen, thanked her for the borrow, and offered him a warm handshake. "Thank you so much for getting me in to see you today, Senator Jones." The senator took his hand, shaking it warmly. Definitely a vote. He smiled. It came off as affable instead of obsequious. "Call me Doug." "Thank you, Doug. That's very kind of you." No problem. Have a seat. The senator gestured toward the leather chair opposite his table and reached for the bottle of Glenfiddich 23 and a second glass. Can I offer you a drink? The stranger nodded. Sure. I don't normally drink in the office, the senator said, his voice conspiratorial, as though he was taking the man into his confidence. But I passed a defense bill today that I'm awfully proud of, so I'm kind of celebrating. Congratulations, the stranger said. The senator poured some scotch. Do you want it straight or on the rocks? Straight, please. The senator passed the glass to the stranger. The stranger lifted his glass. To your defense bill passing. Thank you, the senator said. Now what can I do for you, sir? The stranger unfolded an A4-sized piece of paper and handed it to him. I wondered whether you could take a look at this for me. The senator took the paper, unfolded it. He ran his eyes across the page. There were the faces of 8 people. Each one had a name below to identify them, as well as their designation. Not that he needed their names. He knew each and every one of them very well. And why shouldn't he? He'd met them once a month for nearly 4 years as part of the DARPA Oversight Committee. 4 senators, 2 scientists, and 2 senior military officers, making up just 8 people who held the fate of the future U.S. military power in their grasp. His face had been casually crossed out with a red pen. A shadow of fear passed over the senator, and something caught in his throat. I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name. The stranger smiled. There was something disturbing about it. Dean Godkin. The senator's eyes narrowed, looking at the ghost before him. The name didn't mean anything right away, but when it clicked, it struck him like a sledgehammer. When he had authorized the cleaning team to wipe out everything attached to the RX-16SF program, he'd insisted on seeing the names of all 16 test subjects. After all, it was the very least he could do to the noble Americans who had sacrificed their lives for their nation. He shook his head. He'd been told the slate had been wiped clean. He smiled. This time it came off as obsequious, not affable. His tone firm, but gentle. What can I do for you, son? Dean Godkin smiled. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Senator Jones spread his arms, stepping back from his desk. Now, don't do anything rash. We can come up with a compromise somehow. What is it you want me to do? Absolutely nothing. Godkin laughed sardonically. I already have every name I want and their addresses. Every name you want? The fog lifted, and the senator, thinking of the other names on the list of people who worked on the DARPA Oversight Committee, and the complete realization of his situation manifested. You don't want to do this. The senator turned and ran, but he never even made it to the door. Dean Godkin, the fingers of his left hand affectionately nursing his glass of Glenfiddich 23, withdrew a service-issued pistol with his right and shot the senator in the head twice. He drank the last of his Glenfiddich 23. Chapter 54. Sam Reilly flew the Eurocopter 350 Squirrel across Lake Sipawesk, its tri-rotor blades making a constant thump-thump sound as it churned up the crisp spring air on their way northeast back to Kelsey. Beside him, Sutty listened as he ran through his theory about her mysterious ghosts. These Vikings, who rise up from Valhalla and trouble you once a year, He paused, trying but stumbling to find the right direction or place to begin. They only rise up from the dead during a blood moon? She nodded. That's right. There's never been an anomaly where they come another day? No, never. She smiled, defiantly meeting his gaze. Not even once. Sam's eyes narrowed. And when they do come, what sort of things do they do? A whole bunch of things, she said, her eyes locked on a forest of willow trees swaying in the distance, but her mind witnessing things that had happened in the distant past. Animals are slaughtered. At least a few cattle die, but sometimes a pig, a couple chickens. The acts almost seem too random to be poachers. I mean, we have more than 3,000 head of cattle, and yet they slaughter one or two, butchering them on the spot and leaving the carcass to wild animals to feast. It couldn't have just been a polar bear or something? No. Maybe if it was just one, but not three. Besides, even if we could justify that, it still doesn't explain how it happens every time there's a blood moon. Sam nodded. No, it doesn't. Anything else they do? They generally steal things. Sometimes they damage cars, property, even fences. The destruction is widespread, but seemingly senseless, serving no purpose. How many times did this happen? Once a year, every year during a blood moon. And when did it start? I have no idea. All I can tell you is that it's been going on longer than our family has been farming in the region. So more than 100 years. Sam said, That's so bizarre. So what's your theory? Sam grinned. Who said I had one? I do, she laughed. Besides, I can tell you've been holding out on me, trying to figure things out for yourself before you give it to me. Am I right? Sam let himself laugh out loud. You're right. Okay, so out with it. What have you got? It's not a full theory, and I suppose we'd need to wait until the next blood moon to test it out. But I'm willing to let you have the disconnected strings that I've got, if you're interested. Sure, I'll take them. What have you got? All right. Sam paused, trying to think where to start. Those Jurassic plants inside the cavern, have you ever seen their flowers? No, but the butterflies go berserk just after a blood moon. Right, only ever after a blood moon. That's right. Sam drew a breath. I'll bet you a botanist would be hard-pressed to name them. I've taken some photos of the plants and the butterflies and messaged them to a friend of mine, and we'll find out soon whether my hunch holds any merit. Either way, my guess is that they certainly don't belong in Manitoba. Where do you think they came from? A Hellenistic fleet that first sailed to the Americas sometime during the 1st century. Suddy's eyes widened in wonder. The same place where that clay pot, what did you call it, an amphora, came from? That's right, Sam confirmed. My guess is that the Vikings who once sailed that longboat came across a place I suspect accounts for the origins of Valhalla, known in Viking lore as the place where valiant warriors feast. You see, as with some legends, the story changes with time, and so does its truth. Although I still don't know what Valhalla holds, my guess is it won't be the remains of Viking warriors. So what do you think Valhalla actually is? I don't know, Sam admitted. But I'll tell you what I do know. In the 1st century, a Hellenistic fleet sailed from ancient Greece, led by 2 warriors known as Thor and Odin. They made multiple trips across the Atlantic. Each time, sailors returned with tales more and more fantastical about their victories. their fellow raiders becoming increasingly violent in their conquests. The stories turned to legends, and the legends eventually lost into the mythology of Viking lore. But somewhere, buried beneath nearly 2 millennia, there was a plant that looked like it came straight out of the set for Jurassic Park. Suttie was smiling as she spoke, the words sounding ridiculous when they were spoken out loud, and yet, as Sam listened, he knew with a growing certainty that they were equally correct. And it was the seeds of those plants that were probably stored within the amphorae, which washed up onto the shore, eventually taking hold inside that cavern on Black Bear Island. And those plants flower just once a year, releasing some sort of toxin that sends people crazy, turning them into berserkers who run wild, ravaging my family's land. Sam nodded. And that means whoever's been harvesting these flowers has lived in the area for generations. Suttie's eyes went wide. She drew a sharp breath. This explains the Battle of Fish Creek. Sam looked at her, a wry grin forming on his parted lips. Fish Creek? Uh-huh, she nodded. On a cold April morning in 1885, some 200 Canadian forces clashed with just 40 Métis rebels at a coulee in a place called Fish Creek, Saskatchewan. Go on. The Canadian forces were expected to quell the Northwest Rebellion. It was meant to be a decisive victory. Major General Frederick Middleton, who had taken a hot air balloon to scout the landscape of the battlefield, watched on in horror as more than 200 well-equipped Canadian soldiers were overrun by just 40 poorly armed and ill-equipped Métis rebels. Sam said, That's 5-1, and yet they lost the battle. Google it, Suttie said, with a smile that betrayed her obvious respect for the David versus Goliath type victory. The Battle of Fish Creek has gone down in history as one of the worst military defeats of all time, and historians to this day can't seem to agree how the Métis rebels won the battle. It just seemed like the rebels simply went on a rampage, driven by some mysterious power, and conquered their enemy. Sam grinned, as though they were all high on some sort of berserker drug. Chapter 55. Sam explained to Suttie that he planned to return to the Tehillah to get the Viking Sunstone, Navigation Runestone, and Uunartok disc examined, and hopefully interpreted. He was about to climb into the Eurocopter, and had promised her that he'd keep in touch and update her with any discoveries they might find, when his cell phone rang. He retrieved it from his cargo pocket, glanced at the name next to the incoming call. It read, Margaret. No surname. There didn't have to be. That name alone meant the world to him. Sam hit the green accept button and said, Madam Secretary. The Secretary of Defense's voice was cold and hard. Sam, we need your help. As always, I'm at your service, ma'am. Sam's gaze turned toward the distant forest as he took a few steps to take him out of Suttie's earshot. What do you need? It has to do with what you're investigating. Ice poured into his veins. I told you I'm not going to stop until I find out who's responsible. I'm not asking you to stop. Sam arched an eyebrow. You're not? No. Things have changed which have made much of the original risks moot. How? The secretary said, The DARPA Oversight Committee recently shut down a secret program that tested drugs designed to make super soldiers. She let that acknowledgement sit there for a moment, waiting for him to make a comment. When he didn't, she continued. It was shut down because some of the test subjects inadvertently killed each other, and in Las Vegas, an otherwise normal and respectable woman killed more than a dozen people at a nightclub with a couple shards of broken glass. Sam drew a breath. The experimental drug came from an ancient plant used by a Hellenistic fleet that arrived in the Americas during the 1st century and created a concoction used to turn its soldiers into berserkers. She didn't agree or deny the concept. He took it as a yes. That's why when a friend of mine discovered an image in a cave of the ancient fleet sailing into the Yucatan and some reference to Valhalla, the DARPA Oversight Committee knew they needed to shut the program down and eliminate all evidence of the cave in case someone was to find the location in which the drugs had been harvested. Do I have it about right? Close enough, the Secretary of Defense said. Dean Godkin, one of the test subjects and also the brother of a man whose life you tried to save in Canada, sold the formula for the drugs to a drug cartel, now known colloquially as the Berserkers, an offshoot of an international drug cartel with seriously deep pockets. I've met some of the Berserkers, Sam admitted. They weren't the friendliest people I've had to deal with for a while, but I'm confused. Why are you coming to me with all this now? I thought the DARPA Oversight Committee had put an airtight lid on this thing. They had, and you tried to make me promise to stay out of it, because even you couldn't protect me from the powerful members of the committee? I did. Sam frowned. So why are you coming to me now? Because Dean Godkin went after each member of the DARPA Oversight Committee. Sam pictured the Green Beret, driven mad by the berserker drug, which increased his mental and physical strength while filling him with rage, targeting each and every member of the committee that signed his death warrant. It wouldn't be pretty. How many did he get? As of 6 hours ago, 7. 7? Sam cursed. How many were on the damned committee? She answered without hesitation, her voice cold and mechanical. 8. There's only one person left alive? Sam asked. Who? Sarah Reinhardt, a leading researcher of Harvard's biochemistry faculty. Where's she staying? Sam asked. She's bunkered down at her family's estate, a castle on Vancouver Island. It's naturally well protected by the elements, but she has her own private security team there. I hope she's got a good security team. I believe she does, she said. I'm flying out there today. You? Sam asked incredulously. Why, you? I know her personally, and as a biochemist, and only person left alive from the original oversight committee that dealt with the program, Sarah offers the only insight into this drug. I want her opinion on it and how much of a threat this thing is going to be to national security. Sam could already imagine how much of a threat this thing offered national security. If Dean Godkin was selling the drug to a street gang, it was only a matter of time before terrorists or other militaries around the world got their hands on it. He said, Okay, what do you need from me? We need you to help find Dean Godkin. How would I do that? We believe you have something that he was after, something his brother left you, a USB stick. Sam grinned, glad that he was on his cell phone and that she couldn't see his face in person. If she had, he never would have been able to keep a poker face. It amazed him how much information naturally drifted her way. She must have been fed intel from every direction, and her mind worked like a computer, naturally sifting through what was relevant and what wasn't. instinctively linking several chains of data together to make sense out of a seemingly disjointed bundle of data. All right, I'll do it, but I have no idea where we're going to find him. She paused. To be honest, we believe he will come to you. Me? Sam asked. I'm in Manitoba currently. I can't imagine he's going to show up here. No. We'd like you to catch the next flight to Vancouver Island. The truth hit him like a shard of glass. You want to use me as bait to bring Godkin out of hiding? Yes. If I'm right, all you have to do is step foot on that island, and Godkin will find you. Sam laughed uncomfortably. Let's say that he does find me. What's to stop him putting 2 bullets in my head? Nothing. Everything. What does that even mean? It means that this man's military record is impeccable. He is the epitome of duty and honor. Sam didn't buy it. Yet he's killed 7 members of DARPA's Oversight Committee. He sees those as honorable kills. The committee authorized the death of him and the rest of the test subjects, his platoon, so to speak, and so his honor system has authorized the killings. Sam arched an eyebrow. But not mine? She said, We're pretty certain that's his line of thinking. Sam swallowed hard. It's only my life if you get this thing wrong. Right. She spoke matter-of-factly. Will you do it? He considered his options and answered what he knew he must. Yes, I'll need to contact Tom and bring in some of my people for the project. You can't do that. Why not? Dean's an expert. If he sees you with other people, he'll leave you alone. We can't risk it. This is our one chance to bring him in. How? Just arrive on the island, make contact, and I'll organize a clean-up team to take care of the rest. Sam felt his anger boil. The same team that killed my friend in the Yucatan? Probably, she admitted. I hope I'm not the one about to be cleaned up in the process. No, I give you my word. You're to walk away from this. You're not to be touched by our people. I didn't spend more than a decade grooming you to become one of our nation's best weapons, only to have some secret cleanup team eradicate you. Sam smiled. Your sentimentality is touching, Madam Secretary. Hey, I just wanted you to know I was telling the truth. You will be protected. All right, I'll do it. But I still doubt there's any chance in the world that Dean Godkin is going to find me just because I catch a flight into Vancouver Island. We'll see, she said, ending the call. A moment later, his cell rang again. It was still in his hand. He glanced at the screen, expecting to see Margaret's name on the display. It wasn't. Sam didn't recognize the number. He answered it. Hello. Mr. Sam Reilly? Yes. My name's Dean Godkin. I believe you were looking for me. Chapter 56. Sam listened in silence. He'd learned long ago that the best way to interrogate someone was to keep your mouth shut and let the other person do the talking. Secrets were beasts unto themselves and took effort to restrain. He didn't need to wait long. Once Godkin got talking, it was as if a spigot had been turned, and now the secrets flowed like water from a faucet. Godkin confirmed the Secretary of Defense's story about DARPA running a secret program to test a drug that turned soldiers into super soldiers. He didn't know where the drug originated, but doubted it was developed in a lab. because part of the team of people working on the program included an archaeologist and a historian. He went on to confirm that he'd set about to systematically kill every member of the oversight committee who had signed the order to shut down the program and wipe all evidence of its existence from the face of the earth. When he was finished, Godkin said, "Do you have any questions?" Sam asked, "Why me?" "You're asking why I'm talking to you?" "It did cross my mind." "My brother, Miles Godkin, worked undercover for the CIA and believed someone from the DARPA Oversight Committee was selling the secret formula to a drug cartel. It was this evidence that I believe my brother gave to you." Sam said, "I was told you were the sellout, that you were the one who leaked the formula to a global drug cartel." "You've been told wrong. I don't have anything to do with it. And what's more, 10 to 1, whatever's on that USB stick my brother gave you will prove it." "Do you know who's responsible for the leak?" "No, but if you bring me that USB stick, I can connect it to my half of the cipher, and together we learn the truth." Dean said, "We need to meet." Sam said, "Sure. What do you have in mind?" "You can come to me." "Sure. Where are you?" "No, that's not going to work for me." "Why not?" "If I tell you, you'll just contact the authorities. And right now, at least until we find the contents of that USB stick my brother gave to you, I have no idea who to trust." Sam smiled. "Okay, what do you have in mind?" "Where are you?" Sam looked around, a cold shiver passing over his head. Dean Godkin was a deadly Green Beret, hyped up on berserker drugs. The last thing he needed was to have someone like that looking over his shoulder. He glanced at his surroundings, reassuring himself that he was safe. Sutty lived on hundreds of hectares. A forest of black spruce, ubiquitous throughout so much of Manitoba, lined the end of the property, some 500 feet away. It was unlikely Godkin was waiting inside the forest with a sniper rifle. He drew a breath. "I'm in Manitoba." "Where?" Godkin persisted. "I'm not sure I want to tell you." "I get that. I'll make it easy for you. Where's your nearest airport?" "That seems safe." "Kelsey." "All right. Just give me a minute." In the background, Godkin was typing on a keyboard. "How long will it take you to reach the airport?" "I can be there in 15 minutes. "Good. In 30, there's a flight to Toronto with your name on it." "Wait," Sam said. "Where am I headed?" "You'll find out when you get there." "Wait," Sam protested. 30 minutes isn't enough to get through airport security." "Then I suggest you get going, because your aircraft isn't going to wait, and neither am I." Sam pocketed his cell phone, his heart racing, a million thoughts charging through his mind as he considered his priorities. Sutty exchanged a glance with him. Her face registered that a tempest was brewing. "Is everything all right?" "Not really," Sam said. "I need to get to the airport as quick as I can. I'll explain what's happening on the way." "Okay, I'll drive," she said without hesitation. She pulled out a Subaru Outback. He climbed in, and as soon as the door was shut, she had her foot down, and the all-wheel drive began churning up the gravel as she raced toward the airport. In the end, it took less than 5 minutes. Just before they arrived, she asked, "What about your helicopter?" "Do you mind picking up my friend Tom from Churchill?" "Sure. You want him to pick up the Eurocopter?" "Him or someone else. If you show them the Viking navigational runestone, sunstone, and disk, they will be able to find someone who can translate the runic script, and hopefully we can reverse engineer their voyage. A surprised smile flickered across Sutty's lips. "You want to go after it, don't you?" Sam met her eye. "Valhalla?" "Yeah, that's what you're hoping to find, isn't it?" Sam nodded. "Yeah. You want to come with me?" Sutty grinned. "You bet I do." Chapter 57. Comox Airport, Vancouver Island, Canada. Over the course of the next 16 hours, Sam made a number of flights in the most indirect route anyone had ever taken between Kelsey and Vancouver Island. From Kelsey, he boarded a plane to Toronto, whereupon he was greeted by a member of the flight crew, who handed him tickets for his next flight and ushered him to a flight leaving immediately for Montreal. The same charade continued throughout the night, until he eventually landed at Saskatchewan, followed by Vancouver, and eventually landing at Comox Airport on Vancouver Island. Throughout each of the flights, he had been prevented from making any phone calls. Sam stepped out of the 737 and switched his cell phone back on. As soon as the phone linked with a local cell tower, it updated with a message from Elise. He called her back. "Where have you been?" Elise asked. "I've been in the air." "For 16 hours?" Sam sighed. "It was a scenic flight." "Sure." Elise returned to the reason for her call. "I showed those images to a lepidopterologist." "What images?" Sam asked. And then before she could answer, he said, "And what's a—" Elise said, "Lepidopterology is a branch of entomology concerning the scientific study of moths and the 3 superfamilies of butterflies." "Oh, right," Sam said, suddenly remembering that he'd sent her the photos of the plants and butterflies found near Black Bear Island. "Of course. Go on. What did he or she say?" "He believes your mysterious butterfly came from ancient Greece." "Strange. It should find itself in a cave off Black Bear Island, Manitoba." "Even stranger still. He says that the butterfly was thought to have become extinct somewhere around the 1st century." "You're kidding." "No. That's the last anyone heard or seen of it since then." Sam said, "Thank you, Elise." "No problem. Anything else I can help you with?" "Yeah, I need you to look into someone for me." "Sure, who?" "Sarah Reinhardt. She's currently a professor at Harvard, working in their biochemistry faculty. Apparently, her family owns property on Vancouver Island. That's all I know." "Okay, I'll fill in the gaps." She paused a beat. "Sam, what's this about?" "I don't know yet. All I know is that she was originally part of DARPA's oversight committee. And now everyone else on that committee is dead." "Everyone else?" "Afraid so. Dean Godkin, whom I'm about to meet with, systematically tracked each and every one of them down and killed them." Her voice was stern, yet sympathetic, like a parent grilling a child for being stupid. "And you're meeting up with him?" Sam suppressed a grin. "The Secretary of Defense thinks I'll be okay." "It wouldn't be the first time she's put you in harm's way." "That's true." "Sam." "Yeah." "Have you got this thing under control?" Sam swallowed hard. "Not even close." A moment later, he was greeted by a man at the gate who informed him that a float plane was waiting to take him to his final destination. Sam asked the stranger where he was headed. The man simply shook his head and shrugged, informing him that he was just the messenger. A few minutes later, they had exited the airport and headed down through a dense trail before the forest gave way to the rocky shore of Kai Bay, where a blue de Havilland Canada DHC-2 beaver waited for him. The seaplane rested idly at its anchor in the tranquil water, its pontoons drifting against the beach. There was no pilot nearby. The messenger gestured for him to take a seat inside. Sam stepped across the starboard pontoon, opened the door, and climbed in. Sam turned his gaze to the messenger. "No pilot?" The man shrugged. "I was told you could fly just about anything." It was a statement, not a question. Sam expelled a breath, taking a seat in the cockpit. "Okay, where am I headed?" "I don't know. Honestly, I have no idea." The edges of Sam's lips curled upward. "So, you don't know where I'm headed, and I don't know where I'm headed, and yet I'm to pilot this seaplane there. Does that make sense to you?" The guy shrugged again, as though it was not his problem. "The coordinates have been pre-programmed into the navionics. The fuel tank's full, and I've been assured that it will be ample fuel to go where you're heading. The radio has been disabled, so I suggest you don't deviate from your flight path, or you might just find yourself getting shot down by Canada's Air Force." Sam nodded. "Okay." He switched on the electronic master switch. Running his eyes across the avionics, he frowned. "There's nothing programmed into the GPS?" The messenger nodded, as though expecting the question. "It's pre-programmed to display the coordinates, including your flight vectors and paths, once you reach an altitude of 1,000 feet. "Right," Sam said, and sighed heavily. He couldn't help but smile. There was a certain level of genius in Dean Godkin's plan. By sending him by commercial aircraft, and by ensuring that he didn't take any checked-in luggage, Godkin had been able to make certain Sam hadn't been able to carry a weapon with him. Throughout the flights, his cell phone had been disabled under federal aviation laws, and so he hadn't been able to contact his people for help. And now, he was about to fly to a remote location somewhere within the isolated lands of Vancouver Island. Even if he wanted to message someone about his destination, he wouldn't know it until he was in the air, by which time it would probably take too long for anyone to reach the location before him. And besides, without the radio, it wasn't like he could contact anyone from the air anyway. His cell phone could be used as a satellite phone, but to do so he needed a direct line of sight to the sky, something fairly difficult to achieve during flight, especially with him at the controls. Sam thought about his next move and Godkin's warning that if he deviated from the travel plans, the one-time-only deal was permanently off. Torn, he hoped to hell that his instincts about Godkin had been right, and that the truth would be revealed within the contents of the USB stick that Miles had left him. And with that, he switched the engine on and began his pre-flight takeoff checks. Chapter 58. The de Havilland Canada DHC-2 Beaver was a single-engine, high-wing, propeller-driven short takeoff and landing bush plane. It was perfectly designed for the remote environments of Canada's labyrinth of ubiquitous waterways, lakes, rivers, and bays. Sam turned the key, and the Pratt & Whitney Canada PT6 turboprop engine kicked over. The propeller began to turn with a little sputter before roaring to life, disappearing into an invisible whir as it picked up speed. He ran his eyes across the instruments. The aircraft was well maintained and in good condition. His ears pricked, and he instinctively listened to the engine, which sounded like it was running well. He adjusted the rudder, turning the nose to port, and gave the propeller a sharp burst of power. The aircraft turned into the wind. A moment later, Sam glanced up at the open horizon to confirm that his runway was free of traffic, and pushed the throttle all the way forward. The little propeller raced toward its maximum RPM, and the de Havilland DHC-2 crept forward. sluggish at first, until it had picked up enough speed that the pontoons began to skim the surface of the water, and the aircraft quickly became lithe and maneuverable. Soon Sam needed to work to restrain the seaplane from taking off on its own. He applied just a little bit of forward pressure on the wheel to keep him on the water. When he couldn't keep the aircraft grounded any longer, he gently brought the wheel toward his chest, and the seaplane happily relinquished its earthly restraints, taking to the skies. Sam steadily climbed until he reached 1,000 feet. He leveled off, and a few seconds later, the navionics flashed with a new pre-programmed route. He clicked to accept the route and began scrolling through the map. It turned out he was now heading to a place called Hot Springs Cove. The cove was on the west coast of Vancouver Island, in a southwestern direction of Comox. Despite its location, the flight route had planned to take him north until the Campbell River, before following the valley etched out by Gold River across the island, avoiding the highs of the mountains that adorned the central dividing peaks of Vancouver Island. Sam followed the vectors set on the navionics, heading north until he reached the Campbell River, before banking to the southeast, and eventually setting up in a valley that carved its way across the island. Etched out by Gold River over the eons, he flew in the middle of the valley, while 7,000-foot mountain peaks hugged him from either side of the valley, where pine trees rose like the ramparts of a medieval fortress. Above him, bald-headed eagles soared, while below him a couple grizzlies plucked at the salmon. The valley opened up, Gold River widening into a bay. A black steamboat ushered adventurous tourists through the island's wild west. Sam eased the seaplane around Bligh Island, past Uquot, before briefly taking the aircraft into the North Pacific Ocean and back on a southerly direction, rounding the Twin Mate Islands, before setting up in a due north direction into Hot Springs Cove. He banked north and got his first glimpse of the shallow beach at the end of the basin, where several boats and another float plane were tied to a dock. It was summer, and despite the remoteness, the entire region welcomed throngs of adventurers and fishermen who vacationed there. A small colony of sea lions guarded the entrance to the cove as they lazily soaked in the warm water and adjacent rocks. Hot Springs Cove is a splendid hot spring still enjoyable in its natural state, located in Maquina Provincial Park in the remote northern end of Clayoquot Sound. The boiling spring water bubbles up from deep in the earth and cascades down a small cliff into a series of natural layered rock pools, cooled by the incoming Pacific Ocean surf. Giant Douglas firs lined the rocky coast. Sam set up for a reconnaissance flyover and possible landing into the bay, taking the de Havilland Beaver down low, just 50 feet above the water. Holding her level as he searched for logs and any other impediments that might make for a horrible landing. The water was calm, almost glassy. He brought the seaplane in low, ready to make an easy landing. Sam set the flaps to full and reduced speed. His gaze ran across the bay, where he had a clear run all the way to the end of the bay. He reduced power, and the aircraft began its final few feet of descent. 30 feet, 20 feet, 10 feet. The ocean rose to greet him. Suddenly, the water itself jumped out at him. Dead ahead of him, a gray whale broached out of the water, rising at least 10 feet into the air in the process. Sam swore. He pushed the throttle in full and pulled back on the wheel. The seaplane climbed, but nothing worked fast enough. He knew instinctively that it would be close. He grimaced, holding the wheel to his chest, as hard as he dared. Up ahead, he spotted the massive tail coming out of the water, ready to slam down upon him like a giant fly swatter. They were too close. He would never make it in time, not going over the whale. Sam banked the seaplane, its starboard wingtips dipping low, no more than a few feet out of the water, as he swung around the whale, before gently easing the aircraft back into a straight climb position. His heart pounded in his chest as the threat disappeared with the bay far below. Sam made another circuit and spotted his unintended foe. 2 gray whales, a mother and her calf, were making their way back out to sea. Sam's gaze traced their movements and spotted a large pod of orcas swimming just outside of the cove, like a lethal barricade. The killer whales, Sam knew, were the gray whale's only predator. He watched as the 2 grays began to make an attempt to escape through the deadly barricade. Sam tracked them as the orcas began to give chase. It was like watching one of those wildlife docos, where you want to cry out to the camera person to do something, before that lion eats the helpless springbok. Only even that would be stupid, given that's what the lion eats. It was just nature. But still, Sam couldn't look away, and he found the sight surprisingly disturbing. The gray whales moved quickly, and it looked like they were going to escape. If it had been just the mom, he was sure she would have made it out into the deep ocean without too much trouble. But with her young calf, it might be a different story. The orcas closed in on them, and before they reached the kill, the 2 gray whales dived, disappearing into the waters far below. Sam watched for another couple minutes, trying to find the outcome, but the 2 grays seemed to disappear. He wished them good luck, circled around, and set up for another attempt to land at the Hot Springs Cove. He banked to the left, setting up to do a reconnaissance flypast to rule out any floating logs, small boats, sandbars, or surface debris. He flew over a long distance, making sure his waterway was clear and long enough. The surface of the lake wasn't rough, a condition that would make it hazardous to land. Worse, though, the water was now dead calm. Sam shook his head, surprised by how much the water conditions can change in such a short time. A glassy flat surface reflects like a mirror, one of the most dangerous conditions a seaplane pilot can face. This made it extremely difficult for Sam to judge actual height. When landing on water, one can't rely on an altimeter. The difference between 1 foot and 10 was a thin line between a safe landing or flying your plane with power straight into the water and sinking. When he was ready, Sam opened his side window, making a sharp bank to the left. He wasn't wearing a cap to drop out the window, so instead searched for something else to use to cause ripples. There wasn't anything. He looked at the avionics display and thought seriously of throwing the damn thing overboard. Then, far below, a jet ski raced along the glassy waters of the bay, leaving a series of ripples in its wake. It was just what Sam needed. He flew a sharp 180 degrees turn and set up for his final approach. With the flaps still set at full, he reduced power and brought the seaplane into a glide. Using peripheral vision for cues, he observed the height of trees on shore, his eyes carefully observing the ripples on the water. Just above the surface, he raised the nose. This made the aircraft flare, meaning to lose lift and stall, slowing its descent, causing its twin pontoons to softly hydroplane for a moment before it sank gently into the water. Sam taxied the seaplane in toward the jetty. He found a yellow, temporary visitor's mooring, slowing the de Havilland to a complete stop right next to it. Unclipping his belt, he opened the door and climbed down the ladder. Holding on to the wing support, he reached down and picked the mooring line floating on the surface of the water, tying it off on the cleat at the front of the pontoon. Confident the seaplane was secure, he stepped back into the cockpit, reduced the engine to an idle, before powering off completely. The engine coughed, and the propeller stopped spinning. A man with a rowboat tied to the jetty kindly came to greet him and offered him a ride to shore. Sam took it with his gratitude. He made his way along the jetty to the main boardwalk that headed into the forest. Sam realized, as he took in his surroundings, that Hot Springs Cove was a splendid hot spring, still enjoyable in its natural state. Despite its adventurous tourists, the place hadn't yet been bought up by the big names and made into an elite resort for the rich or for the masses. It brought a smile to Sam's face. He walked on a little and spotted the boiling spring water bubbles as they rose up from deep in the earth and cascaded down a small cliff into a series of natural layered rock pools, cooled by the incoming Pacific Ocean surf, sending steam into the air. The spring water appeared wickedly hot and was clear like a distillery, with just a faint smell and taste of sulfur. He didn't get much farther before he was greeted by a ghost. "Hello," Dean Godkin said, wearing nothing more than a pair of board shorts, stepping out of the warm waters. "Godkin?" Sam asked. Dean smiled at him. "Welcome to the island, Sam Reilly." Chapter 59. Sam stared at Dean Godkin. The brotherly resemblance to Miles was indisputable. Where Miles was muscular, Dean was next level. The man looked like he belonged on the front cover of a Men's Health magazine, or possibly a Hitachi bulldozer magazine, for that matter. The man was roughly 5'6". He would have been considered short by American standards, but despite his height, he looked formidable by any measure. At a guess, he was 180 pounds without an ounce of fat on him. Sam locked eyes with Godkin. He had dark gray eyes. There was something pensive and intelligent in his gaze. The subtle power of absolute authority that came with holding one's life in his hands appeared to be etched in the lines on his face. A moment later he lowered his gaze, really seeing Godkin for the first time. The edges of Sam's lips curled into a grin. Dean's board shorts were decorated with the images of pink frangipanis and looked decidedly Hawaiian, forming a jarring contrast to his weapon-like physique and deadly reputation. He was still wet from the nearby hot spring in which he'd been bathing, and steam rose from all over his muscular body. He had broad shoulders that tapered into a narrow waist, where his abdominal muscles appeared to have been chiseled by Michelangelo himself. From his shoulders casually hung arms as thick as a man's thighs, with triceps and biceps so sharp they appeared almost cartoonish in nature. Sam began to laugh. He was expecting to find a gun pointed in his direction, but instead found a younger-looking Arnold Schwarzenegger dressed for a Hawaiian vacation. "You look comfy." Dean shrugged. "Hey, it took you long enough to reach me. Besides, this was my show of faith to you." Sam rolled his eyes. "Come again." Dean clarified. "I'm not carrying a weapon." "I can tell." "I meant for you to see." Dean, registering the blank expression on Sam's face, turned his palms outward in a placating gesture. "That way you know I'm on your side." Sam wasn't convinced. Besides, Godkin was a Green Beret, hyped up on Berserker drugs. Both of them knew that Dean could probably kill Sam in a hand-to-hand fight without breaking a sweat. So the whole not carrying a weapon thing wasn't particularly reassuring. Unsure where else to go, Sam got to the point of his trip. I brought the USB stick. Do you have somewhere for us to go find the truth? Yeah, I've rented a cabin. It's nearby. We'll go there and put it into my laptop. Sam followed Dean along the well-maintained cedar boardwalk as it meandered through an enchanting rainforest. Giant Douglas firs framed the majestic coastline, rising some 250 feet into the air, like ancient sentinels guarding the source of the hot spring. 10 minutes later, Godkin stopped, gesturing with his right hand toward a small log cabin. Sam arched an eyebrow. Yours? My humble abode for the past 2 days. Not really sure what words seemed appropriate, Sam said, It looks nice. It is, Dean said, opening the door. Come in, let's go find some answers. Sam stepped through the door, studying the place as he walked in, looking for hidden weapons or anything else that Godkin might be capable of using to attack him. Inside, the cabin was Spartan. There were several bunk beds. There were no mattresses or sheeting. At the end of the one farthest away, a single sleeping bag, already folded into its bag, rested on its own. Next to the door, there was a small backpack. Otherwise, the cabin was empty. Godkin grabbed a towel from the backpack, dried himself, and threw a shirt on. He removed his laptop from the backpack and took a seat on the floor, looking surprisingly limber and comfortable there, more like a yogi expert than a muscle-bound jarhead. He opened the screen and pressed the on button. The computer was solid, covered in what appeared to be a hardened shell of metal, the sort the military used for its soldiers throughout the world during deployment. At a guess, given his history, it was issued to him by the U.S. Army. A photograph proudly adorned the desktop's wallpaper. It depicted 2 brothers. Sam recognized a younger Dean and Miles Godkin. Even at a glance, Sam realized that they were twins. Somehow it shocked him. Since the photo had been taken, Dean had obviously gained muscle. Perhaps the Berserker drug had aided him in that endeavor, while Miles had somehow lost some of his size, and Sam began to mentally question whether or not the kid could have intentionally done so for his secret mission. Then again, maybe both Godkin brothers were lying to him. Sam's eyes narrowed in on the image. Suddenly he recognized where they were standing when the photo had been taken. It was the entrance to a large government building with a marbled floor. At their feet was an American eagle above a shield, with a compass rose at the center. Sam knew the symbol well, along with its meaning. The American eagle is the national bird and is a symbol of strength and alertness. The shield is the standard symbol of defense. Intelligence provided to our policymakers is to help defend our country. The radiating spokes of the compass rose depict the convergence of intelligence data from all areas of the world to a central point. It was the CIA seal. The 2 Godkin brothers were at the CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. Sam drew a breath. Your brother really did work for the CIA? Godkin opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. Either he didn't want to try and explain the truth or justify himself, or he decided they no longer had the time for such petty arguments about what his brother was really doing that day he was nearly killed at the St. Martin's Sea Caves in the Bay of Fundy, before successfully being killed that night. Sam studied the image, both faces. Then suddenly everything clicked. Miles wasn't the only one who was CIA. No, Dean confirmed. You spent your entire life in the U.S. Army, but when you were selected for this program, you, decided to join the CIA? Dean shook his head. No. Sam closed his eyes, picturing what would have caused him to spy on his own people. Miles recruited you." "Bingo," Dean said. "Come on, I'm hoping he came through with the goods, or all has been for nothing, and I'm likely to get permanently wiped from the face of the earth." He clicked on a document still open on the desktop. It was labeled Berserker Investigation. Looking over Godkin's shoulder, Sam spotted several documents pertaining to an investigation. At the end of the third row was a document labeled Brother Cipher. He clicked the document, and another obscure hypertext link came up. Sam's eyes narrowed. "What was your brother doing?" Dean held his hand out. "Pass me your USB stick, and we'll find out together." Sam retrieved the stick from a zippered pocket on his right thigh and handed it to Godkin. "You don't know it all?" "Thanks," Dean said, inserting the USB stick into the computer. He withdrew a satellite phone attached to the laptop case and set it up so the laptop could connect to the internet. On the phone, an image of 3 satellites circling the globe began to indicate the phone was searching for its connection. While he waited, Dean said, "Look, the CIA got wind of a new super drug being developed through DARPA. There were some talks about whether or not the drug was ethical, but that wasn't really their concern." Sam frowned. "It wasn't?" Godkin almost laughed. "Of course it wasn't. The moral and ethical debate about performance-enhancing drugs on the battlefield was lost decades ago. Hell, the military is constantly using technology to build better warships, aircraft, weapons, and armor. Why shouldn't they give soldiers the pharmacological edge of performance-enhancing drugs?" "I don't know. The same reason it's frowned on in competitive sports, I guess." Godkin shook his head. "This isn't about being a good sport and not cheating. In battle, drugs can save lives. They can make soldiers stronger, faster, while increasing their mental acuity, which all in turn work to allow them to complete their missions better, faster, and without as much loss of life. Hell, soldiers have long taken drugs to help them fight." "They have?" Sam asked, a little tone of surprise in his voice. "They sure have. Amphetamines like dexedrine were distributed widely to American, German, British, and other forces during World War II, and to U.S. service members in Korea, Vietnam, Kuwait, Iraq, and Afghanistan. In 1991, the Air Force Chief of Staff stopped the practice because, in his words, Jedi Knights don't need them. But the ban only lasted 5 years. DARPA, an agency that does cutting-edge research for the U.S. Department of Defense, is trying to make soldiers kill-proof by developing super nutrition pills and substances to make them smarter and stronger. New drugs that reduce the need for sleep, such as modafinil, are being tested. Researchers are even looking into modifying soldiers' genes." "All right," Sam said. "So if the CIA weren't worried about the ethics of this berserker drug, what were they concerned about?" Godkin leveled his gaze on Sam. His tone was cold and hard. "Where the drug came from, and more importantly, where it was going." Sam paused a beat, not sure he'd heard right. "Come again?" "No one knows where these drugs came from. In fact, talking to the pharmacologist who worked on the program, the drug, RX-16SF, can't be produced synthetically. That means they've sourced the biocompounds from a plant somewhere, and given the secrecy on its location, I'll bet you my retirement fund, wherever those plants are found, they're sure as shit not stateside." "Let me guess," Sam said. "They're found in Manitoba, Canada?" "Maybe. That I don't know." "But your brother was in Canada, trying to infiltrate the Berserker gang?" The satellite phone turned green to indicate it had secured a connection. Godkin clicked synchronize, and the laptop paired with the satellite phone for some lightning-fast Wi-Fi. Yeah, the CIA believed that the Berserker gang had bought the drug from someone within the RX-16SF program. I was told by the Secretary of Defense that you were the one selling the drug. He shook his head. It wasn't me, that's for damn sure. And with that, he opened the data in his brother's USB stick, linking the two ciphers together, and the computer began to link up to a data storage cache buried deep within the dark net. Chapter 60. Sam stared at the secret website. It appeared to have been hundreds of hours of CIA surveillance and research on the Berserker gang, who had only seemed to come into existence roughly 2 years earlier, the same time the RX-16SF program began. Godkin skipped the videos and kept scrolling until he came to his brother's report. There were hours of data to review, but both their sets of eyes landed on the most important statement in the whole report. It was a single name, and it purported who the leak was within the RX-16SF program, the person making a fortune selling U.S. military secrets, Sarah Reinhardt. Sam and Dean exchanged a glance. It provided some answers, while asking a whole new set of questions. The biggest, the first one to come to Sam's mind was this why, of the entire list of people involved in the program, only Sarah Reinhardt was still alive? Did Dean Godkin leave her to last because he suspected her as being the guiltiest of betrayals to his country? Or had he left Sarah Reinhardt alive because the two of them were in this thing together? Sam considered how to play his hand. The last thing he wanted to do was confront Godkin on his own turf. No, he was better off waiting this out, seeing how it played out. A minute later, Sam's cell phone rang. He glanced at the screen. It showed the incoming call was from Elise. Sam answered it without preamble. "What have you got?" "Sarah Reinhardt is a leading biochemistry lecturer at Harvard University. She's also rich. I mean, rich enough that she has a small castle, a.k.a. private citadel, on the banks of the Seymour Narrows." "That's right here on Vancouver Island." "Yes, somewhere up north. It's meant to be set on a particularly dangerous part of the river, where the current acts as a natural deterrent, let's call it, elemental protection, for her family's estate." "They're that rich?" "Yes, but she wasn't always rich. In fact, her bank account has, and I say this with all pun intended, recently gone berserk in the past 2 years. She's the one who sold out RX-16SF to a drug cartel." "It would look like it." Elise's tone had an almost laughing lilt to it. "It gets better." "Do tell." "Even though Sarah Reinhardt works in the U.S., her permanent residency is her homeland, Canada. Want to guess where she grew up?" "I have no idea." "A small town to the west of Black Bear Island, Manitoba." "Good God," Sam said. "She knew about the Berserker drug long before DARPA started investigating it." "Not only did she know it, she owns the company that first sold the rights to DARPA to investigate." Chapter 61. Comox, Vancouver Island. The de Havilland Canada DHC-2 Beaver banked to the right before settling into a glide over the crystal-clear, calm waters of the Kai Bay, easing back on the throttle until the little aircraft flared, before its pontoons gracefully sank into the bay. It was an easy landing in a highly forgiving plain. Sam motored toward the shore until the twin pontoons touched the rocky beach. He then swung the rudder around full and gave the propeller one short burst. The seaplane turned on its axis, finishing with its nose pointed out toward the bay. Sam cut the engine, and the prop coughed, slowed, and eventually came to a complete stop. He opened the door and dropped a small anchor. The same messenger who had picked Sam up from the airport met them on the shore, taking the keys and what appeared to be a large tip from Dean. They began walking up the trail. Halfway up the trail, Sam stopped Dean. "How do you really want to handle this?" Dean got straight to the point. "You mean, how are we going to get Sarah Reinhardt?" "Yeah, I mean, you looked at those satellite images of her estate. It would be a nightmare for the Canadian Mounties to raid. The place is so well defended, naturally. It would take a small army to storm the citadel." "That's what I was thinking," Dean said wistfully. "You want to take it by force with a private army?" "No, nothing so ridiculous. Besides, time is a matter of essence. We need to capture her now, before she has time to prepare." "Well, what else are you suggesting?" Dean Godkin said, "A small, covert operation. You and myself. We go in via boat and capture Sarah Reinhardt and bring her to trial." Sam met his eye. "You sure you don't mean execute without a jury?" "No, this needs to be public. I want this to come out." "You want her dead?" "Of course I do. She's responsible for the deaths of a lot of good people, my people, including my brother. But the best way to get revenge is to bring her in and shut down her entire operation. So I'll swallow my pride and bring her in for a trial." "Do you promise you're not going to go in there and shoot her dead?" "The thought did cross my mind. But no, that won't shut down the program. Someone else will take her place. The only way to bring this thing forward is to bring Reinhardt in for a trial." "All right, then we stick to the plan. If we're going to do this, we're going to need all the help we can get." "What did you have in mind?" "There's a woman, Deborah Easley. She helped save your brother from drowning at St. Martin's Sea Caves. She actually lives at the point, just overlooking the main runway at Comox. She's organized to bring in 2 friends of hers who might be able to help us out." "Help?" Dean's brow furrowed with confusion. "I thought you didn't want to make this a personal army thing." "I don't. These 2 people are here to provide some expert local advice about the region. One is named Mark. He's a 3rd-generation logger who has worked on the island all his life. If anyone knows something about the Seymour Narrows, it's him." "And the other guy?" "He's named Doug. A real wild man, Deb tells me. He goes out and hunts in the dangerous wilderness at the north of the island. She says if we want to talk about access and things, he's the guy to talk to." "Can we trust them?" "Yeah," Sam shrugged. "Deb says we can. Besides, I'm not telling them we want to kidnap a rich woman who lives there. We just want to find out how to beat the river. From what I've read, it takes serious local knowledge to reach it." "You sure we can't fly?" "No. I've looked at the maps. The river is too dangerous to land on. We're just as likely to get sucked up into some sort of whirlpool when we land. No, we'll have to take a small powerboat." "All right. Let's go meet your friend." They walked up to the airport, following the route around Kai Road, before stopping at the gate of a large house right on the point overlooking the bay. The house was surrounded by a manicured garden with verdant grass, where 2 deer, a mother and her fawn, nibbled happily. They stopped, looked up at Sam and Dean, saw that they meant them no harm, and went back to nibbling. Sam knocked on Deb's door. She opened it a few seconds later. "Hello, Sam." "Hi, Deb," Sam said. "Thanks for helping us out. I really appreciate it." "No problem," she said, her eyes landing on Dean. "You look almost exactly like your brother." Chapter 62. They followed Deb through her house to a small table and chairs out the back that overlooked the bay all the way out to the mainland. Sam's eyes swept the spectacular vista. Her property was roughly 30 feet above the bay, giving her an excellent vantage point. The yard was Spartan, with a few manicured plants surrounding a grassed area, where a single spruce tree dominated the vista, upon which a large bald-headed eagle stood perched upon its massive nest. The tide was out, and the dark stones that lined the shore stretched nearly 200 feet out into the bay. A couple grown women and a whole bunch of kids collected seashells. Deb pointed them out, proudly telling Sam that they were her daughters and grandkids. At the table, Sam and Dean were introduced to Mark and Doug. They sat down, and Deb offered some coffee straight from the pot. Sam accepted the offer, and Dean knocked it back, asking for some water instead. A few minutes later, after some basic civilities were met, Mark said, "I hear you need to reach a property along the Seymour Narrows." "That's right. It's a long story, but we'd rather not be seen in the process." Doug said, "Why not go in over land, then?" Dean shook his head. "We're fairly certain the owner of the house in question has a high-tech security surveillance system in place through the woods. We might get lucky, but we're most likely to be caught." "Whereas, coming by the water, you can come straight up through the front door," Mark said. "I mean, there's much less risk of people coming in through the Narrow, but the fact is, people do take their boats there. So what's to stop you being spotted even via the water?" "Nothing," Sam admitted. "But at least we'll have their security down to a smaller area. If she's going to be tipped off that we're coming, the less time we can make it between finding out and us actually being there, the better." "Okay." Mark suppressed a grin. "Tell me, what do you know about the Seymour Narrows?" "Not much. I've looked at them on a map, and I can see that there's a hell of a lot of ocean water being squeezed between a dangerously narrow point. I know they have a reputation of creating a fairly dangerous environment for boating." Mark genuinely laughed at that. "Dangerous might be the understatement." Sam sighed. "All right, so tell us about the Seymour Narrows." Mark drew a breath, trying to consider where to begin. Seymour Narrows is a 3-mile section of the Discovery Passage in British Columbia, known for strong tidal currents. Discovery Passage lies between Vancouver Island at Menzies Bay, British Columbia, and Quadra Island, except at its northern end, where the eastern shoreline is Sonora Island. The section known as Seymour Narrows begins about 11 miles from the south end of Discovery Passage, where it enters the Georgia Strait near Campbell River. For most of the length of the Narrows, the channel is about half a mile wide. Through this narrow channel, currents regularly reach 15 knots. That's where Ripple Rock once existed? That's right. The underwater mountain lay smack bang in the middle of the Seymour Narrows. Although the water was deep, at low tide the mountain's south peak came within about 10 feet of the surface. This obstacle, invisible from the surface, posed a hazard to the bottom of ships, as well as creating waves and whirlpools. In total, Ripple Rock damaged or sunk 20 large ships and more than 100 small ones. At least 114 lives were lost in the wrecks. But someone got rid of it? Yeah, Ripple Rock was a submerged Twin Peak mountain, that lay just 9 feet beneath the surface of Seymour Narrows. It was a serious hazard to shipping. The gunboat USS Saranac was one of the rock's first recorded victims. On April 5th, 1958, after 27 months of tunneling and engineering work, Ripple Rock was blown up with 1,375 tons of Nitromex 2H explosive, making it the largest commercial non-nuclear blast in North America. The Halifax explosion in 1917 was larger, but it was not a deliberate act. So, how dangerous are the Narrows these days? The Seymour Narrows is part of a maze-like series of small channels and cuts stretching between Seattle and Alaska known as the Inside Passage. It's often frequented by cruise ships today, but the spectacular coastal views and protection from open ocean come at a price. The areas are made dangerous by tidal currents. These oceanic capillaries are where the sea breathes in and out in the form of tides. Ocean rapids, like Seymour's, are the result of a differential between tidal elevations at either end. These differentials essentially create bidirectional ocean rivers. Add a large, jagged underwater rock to the already difficult-to-steer passage, and you have a recipe for shipwrecks. The ground shook suddenly, with the might of an earthquake, filled by a terrible roar like thunder splitting the clouds, before the sky above turned dark with the roar of a squadron of fighter jets, taking off just above Deb's house. It was so loud Sam had to cover his ears. When the jets disappeared toward the horizon, Sam asked, "What was that?" Deb smiled. "That's the Canadian Forces Base Comox 19 wing. They're flying McDonnell Douglas CF-18 Hornet fighter interceptors." Sam watched them as they banked simultaneously in perfect formation and headed north. "Do they do that often?" "Not too often, just a couple times a day. You get used to it, really, living underneath a RCAF base." "I guess so." Over the next 20 or so minutes, Doug and Mark debated about the best times to approach the Seymour Narrows and how to do so. It was decided that slack tide was the only time to even attempt it, and a jet boat, like a large inflatable Zodiac, with twin or even quad outboard motors, designed to overcome the ocean rapids, which flowed at more than 15 knots, was the only vessel to use. When they were finished, Sam asked, "Anything else we should know?" Doug folded his arms across his chest. "Yeah. Watch out for the grizzlies up there." Sam frowned. "Grizzlies? I didn't think they made it out to the island." "Oh, they do." Mark backed Doug up. Doug said, "They generally swim across the channel from the mainland, although there have been some reports over the past few years of them actually hibernating on the island. They're particularly common on the Campbell River, where you're going." Dean said, "I don't think they'll be a problem. I assure you we'll be the deadliest species on the island." Doug laughed at that. "Oh, yeah? What sort of weapons are you packing?" Dean wasn't planning on being forthcoming on his not-so-small arsenal he had in storage just for this specific trip. Watching Dean for a response and being met with only silence, Doug patted him on the shoulders and said, "Good luck with it, because, just so you know, unless you're armed for an African safari with the sort of caliber weapon needed to take down an elephant, the grizzlies will make short work of you." Sam didn't want the bravado to get out of hand. Instead, he changed the topic, drawing it back to the interesting fact that grizzlies were living on Vancouver Island. "That must be a nightmare, having the grizzlies permanently on the island." "Not really," Doug replied. "From the top of the mountain to the valley bottom and estuaries, they are a keystone species for biodiversity." "Really?" Sam asked, surprised to find Doug so much of an environmentalist. Doug smiled. Grizzlies play a huge role in nature, particularly in coastal ecosystems. Salmon carcasses, they discard fuel tree and plant growth, and in the alpine, they cultivate the soil by digging up squirrel holes and bulbs. What about the black bears? Sam asked. What about them? Doug replied. I thought Vancouver Island had the densest population of black bears in the world. Uh-huh. There's about 7,000 living on the island. Plenty of them up there along the Campbell River, but they won't cause you much trouble. Sam asked, Do the grizzlies and black bears get along? I think they're mostly indifferent to each other, Doug said. That is, unless they're short of food or territory. Sam suppressed a grin. Then what happens? Doug turned to Mark. You want to tell him what you found in your backyard? Mark shrugged. I was out walking with my dog a couple years ago and came across a black bear completely gutted. Sam's eyes narrowed. You think a grizzly bear did it? Well, I can tell you now there's no other animal on Vancouver Island capable of doing that. Dean gritted his teeth, smiling maliciously. I could name at least one other animal. Sam stood up. All right, it's been interesting hearing about your take on navigating the Seymour Narrows and about the grizzly bears, but we'd better get going. You're welcome, Mark said. Doug said, If you head up to the township of Campbell River, there's a marina there. I believe there's a tour company that offers ocean rapid tours. I doubt they will be interested in renting out one of their craft, but you never know. Sam said, Thanks, that's a good idea. We'll look into it. Sam and Dean thanked Deb for her help, and Sam promised to tell her how everything panned out in the end. They left and walked back to the long-term parking where Dean had left his rental car, along with the arsenal he planned to use to assault Sarah Reinhardt's citadel. It would take planning and preparation, but Sam was beginning to see that it would be possible to capture Reinhardt. The question remained whether that was the best course of action. As he pondered this, his cell phone rang, and suddenly everything had changed. Chapter 63. Sam glanced at his cell phone. The incoming call was from Margaret, a.k.a. the U.S. Secretary of Defense. He answered it immediately. Madam Secretary? I'm afraid she's a little busy right now, came an unfamiliar woman's voice. May I take a message? Sam thought back to Margaret's last message. She was on her way to meet Sarah Reinhardt now, and a cold shadow crept down his spine. Sam felt his heart skip a beat. Who are you? My name is Sarah Reinhardt. Reinhardt. Sam said the name slowly, as though it seemed unfamiliar to him. I'm sorry, you have me at a loss. How do I know you? And why do you have the Secretary of Defense's cell phone? She laughed. Let's not play games. You know who I am, and I know who you are. What's more, you and I both need each other. Okay, I'm listening. Reinhardt said, I have Margaret. People believe she's here as my guest, but if you were to send in an assault team, I assure you she wouldn't come out of the attack alive. Sam drew a breath. All right, what do you suggest? An exchange. The USB and Dean Godkin for her. I don't even know what's on it. She said, but I do. And I assure you, I want to keep it that way. You're proposing a trade? Yes. Sam's eyes met Godkin's in the distance. "All right. I'll do it." "And Sam, I don't want to have half the bloody U.S. Navy coming in on me. I'm giving you this one chance. It's just you and Godkin coming in via boat. If I spot anyone else, I'll kill her myself. Do I make myself clear?" Sam gritted his teeth. "Crystal." Godkin looked at him, his piercing gray eyes landing on him like the Inquisitor. "She knows we're coming, doesn't she?" Sam shrugged. "She's got an idea." "She might be expecting us, but not this quickly." Sam nodded. "No, she's not expecting us. Not like this." Chapter 64. Campbell River Marina. Sam stepped into what appeared to be a red floating barn house. It was the main office of the Adventure Sightseeing Tour Company. Behind the counter, a 20-something-year-old woman with long blonde hair, a big smile, and a thick ski jacket booked an older couple in for a guided tour of the ocean rapids. When she was finished, Sam introduced himself and asked if she had any vessel for rent. She apologized and informed him that the company didn't rent any of their fleet out, but that he could hire a guide and a boat for a private adventure. After some discussions and eventually managing to get through to the owner of the company, Sam handed down one hell of a deposit and paid an exorbitant fee to hire a vessel for 24 hours. The guide, a woman named Beck, brought him and Dean out to the last finger of the marina, which housed a large Zodiac. She said, "This is Roxy, our newest Zodiac, built by Victorian-based builders Titan Boats. She has been custom designed to meet the unique environment found along the Campbell River and Seymour Narrows. She has twin 300-horsepower Yamaha outboards, which will allow you to churn your way through the worst of the ocean rapids found anywhere along the Vancouver Isles." Sam ran his eyes across the vessel. It looked like one of those jet boats you see taking tourists up rivers, trying to scare them by getting dangerously close to rocks as they scream along. It was basically an oversized Zodiac inflatable. It had a standing pilot house with a wheel toward the back of the boat, and about a dozen seats up front in the complete open. They would be sitting ducks as they approached Reinhardt's estate. He didn't trust her, but he hoped to hell that she would keep her word to avoid the wrath of the U.S. Department of Defense. All she had to do was keep her cool long enough for Sam to make the exchange. After that, it was anybody's guess what would happen. Sam studied the pilot house. It was standing with a small cover for sun protection over a small framework of aluminum, at the back of which was a rescue buoy and what appeared to be an oversized sea scooter. Sam looked at the saleswoman. "What's the story with the diver propulsion vehicle?" "Oh, that's for use in the case of a person overboard." Sam frowned. "Come again?" Beck said, "The whirlpools along the Seymour Narrows are so powerful that it would be impossible to swim against them to escape their deadly clutches. Thus, for safety, each of our Zodiacs have a highly powerful DPV. There are 2 breathing regulators, but just enough air for roughly 5 minutes of consumption by 2 people in shallow depths." Sam looked at her, a wry and incredulous grin plastered across his lips. "You're kidding, right?" "No, I'm deadly serious." "Has it ever been used?" "No, not yet, and I hope it will never have to." "I'm not sure it's the best solution." "Really? What do you know about these things?" she asked, her voice dubious but polite. I've had a little bit of experience recently with whirlpools and DPVs. I think you'd be hard-pressed to rescue someone using one, especially with just 5 minutes' supply of air. She shrugged. I don't know, but all the more reason to be careful out there. Sam nodded. Okay, we will be. Sam thanked her, and she wished them well. A few minutes later, Dean turned up with his goodies in their military box on top of a wheelbarrow. They loaded the box onto the boat, and a few minutes later, Sam turned the ignition, and the twin 300-horsepower Yamaha outboards roared to life with a throaty growl. Dean untied the lines, climbed on board, and Sam motored Roxy out into the river. They headed north for about 15 minutes before pulling into the calm waters of a nearby estuary to gear up. Godkin opened his storage box. It looked like something that would have made Rambo proud. There were grenades, pistols, a sniper rifle, and a couple submachine guns. Godkin handed Sam a Kevlar bulletproof vest. It probably won't do you much good. Anyone worth anything will put bullets in your head as soon as we step off the boat. But, hey, no reason not to protect yourself where you can. Sam took it, placing the vest over his shirt. Thanks. It looked more than a little obvious, but what did that matter? Reinhardt must know that he wasn't going to walk into a trap completely defenseless. He looked at Godkin. His vest looked different somehow. It had places for weapons and all sorts of things. His eyes narrowed on Godkin's chest. What are those? Godkin pulled back the Velcro covers, revealing 6 grenades. I know how this is going to go, and I have no intention of going quietly. Sam said, You don't know that. Godkin stopped him with the wave of his hand. You and I both know Reinhardt needs me and the USB stick. You and the Secretary of Defense might get lucky, but that's not on the cards for me. Sam was going to try and say something in Godkin's defense, but stopped himself. Godkin was speaking the truth. Reinhardt needed him. If they had more time to go in with a Special Forces assault team, they might be able to save the Secretary of Defense and still walk away. But as it was, with the time constraints, it was unlikely any of them were getting out alive, and even less likely that Godkin was. Sam said, All right, but if we're going to do this, I think I have a better idea of how we're going to win. And also there's one thing we have going for us. Godkin said, Oh, yeah? What's that? Sam's voice was cold and unbroken. Reinhardt knows all about you, but she has no idea who she's picked a fight with when she came after me. Chapter 65. Roxy, the overpowered jet boat, raced north along the Campbell River. It was midday. The sky was a regal blue brindle with the softest accents of white. The crisp air was warmed by the beams of sun, making the river sparkle like diamonds in nature's paradise. Sam motored past Menzies Bay, the one just before the Narrows. Up ahead, he got his first glimpse of Seymour Narrows, connecting the Johnstone Strait in the north to the Strait of Georgia in the south. The water looked deceptively calm. It was a deep sapphire blue, with shades of viridian nearer to the jagged rocky shore. There were a series of white and disturbed waters up ahead, indicating highly aerated sections of the river. The tide had just turned, so the greatest amounts of water were about to be forced through the narrowest point in the river, where 2 oceans of water met. Sam motored slowly, trying to get a feel for the river, before he upped the throttle and tried to escape its lethal tendrils. In the back of his mind, he recalled what Deb's friend Mark had said regarding the strange water system. There's no certainty where a whirlpool will form, and even on a perfectly still river, they have the ability to appear out of nowhere. Still, there are things to remember that help you increase your odds of predicting their occurrence. They tend to appear just downstream of areas where the water gets funneled into a constricted area. Where the waterway opens up again, you'll probably get an eddy, localized backcurrent, and there will be a line where the two opposing currents cross, known as an eddy line. If the strengths of these currents is high enough, a whirlpool can appear. Of course, there can also be considerations underneath the water, such as shelves that can contribute, so whirlpools are not always easy to predict. Sam looked at Dean, who was holding onto the side rail with a single hand. His expression was unperturbed, even relaxed, as though the elemental dangers were nothing to him. More than that, they only reinforced his belief that he was the most dangerous thing for 100 miles. Given what they were up against, Sam was glad that the man felt that way. He eased the throttles forward, and Roxy motored against the strong current, barely keeping pace. He didn't gun it, not yet. He wanted to get a feel for the extreme power of Mother Nature. He was tiptoeing his way along. A small maelstrom opened up in his path. It was probably only 3 or 4 feet across, but it was deep. Sam couldn't see its bottom. In his jittery state, it appeared to run to the ocean floor. Fueled by fear, he increased the throttle probably a little more than he needed and nudged the Zodiac out of its pull. A passing log about half the size of a telegraph pole was not so lucky. Sam watched in awe as it was sucked down the vortex and out of sight before the whirlpool closed over it like a giant mouth. What seemed like minutes later, but was probably only seconds, the log's buoyancy triumphed over the dissipated current, shooting upright out of the water like a breaching whale some 50 or more feet away. Sam knew that whirlpools in this area varied from the thousands of insignificant, harmless, although they will still change your course, to hundreds of open whirlpools several feet across, and which are steep-sloped and several feet deep, capable of grabbing and capsizing small boats, to a few huge and stationary pools 30 to 40 feet across, and capable of sinking even large boats. Up ahead, 2 opposing currents began to meet, forming a large, stationary ocean rapid, of which the Seymour Narrows and Skookumchuck Rapids were notorious. Sam reduced power until Roxy became stationary against the 15-knot current, as he considered the best way to approach it. The ocean rapid looked like one of those stationary waves at a mechanical surf park. The water itself was glossy instead of foamy, almost surreal. 2 kayakers wearing double life jackets crested the wave and began screaming with joy as they rode the unbelievable rapid. Sam and Dean exchanged a glance. Sam said, "Now those people are nuts." Dean checked his weapons. The 2 of them were about to take on an entire drug cartel on the boss's home turf. He made a wistful smile. "Yeah, completely crazy." Sam pushed the twin throttles all the way forward, and Roxy's powerful outboard whined as her strength began to overcome the current. Sam said, "Hold on." Godkin gave a half-shrug, as though nature could throw at him anything he couldn't handle. The Zodiac hit the wave slowly. Her bow simply rode the base of the ocean rapid. For a few seconds they were stationary, trapped in the grip of its awesome power. The engine's pitch edged closer to a scream, and Roxy's bow finally broached the crest of the wave with a giant splash. the boat dropped down into another world. Sam felt like they were edging through a battle zone, a strange cross between no man's land on the Western Front and some sort of utopic paradise best left to the Discovery Channel. Small whirlpools, known as piglets, began erupting all over the place, their small but powerful current sending the Zodiac every which direction as he fought to escape their pull. Above them, a convocation of more than 100 bald-headed eagles filled the sky, temporarily darkening the sun. The apex predators seemingly flying and diving and reaping the easy rewards of the battleground as nature turned to pandemonium. A few seconds later, Sam's eyes spotted the cause of the strange sight, about 100 feet upriver where a giant maelstrom had opened up, its vortex running at least 20 or possibly even 30 feet deep. All that water being sucked down into the spiraling whirlpool had to go somewhere, and it began gushing out like a subdued geyser, where salmon, by the hundreds, were inadvertently thrown into the sky, and predators gorged on the plentiful fish with indulgence. 3 grizzly bears climbed down a large tree that jutted out from a rocky outcrop to the west bank, taking their share of the helpless fish. Somewhere toward the eastern bank, several seal lions lazed with indifference on a small island, and beside the island, jutting out along a point on Quadra Island, directly opposite the Ripple Rock lookout, a citadel made of locally quarried granite rose majestically from the water's edge, perched up high like the greatest predator of them all. Sam turned Roxy into a small inlet carved into the edge of the river, where some massive boulders with more than a dozen sea lions lazing formed a natural shelter, behind which a narrow channel had been carved into the stone's edge, leaving enough room for him to pilot the Zodiac up into a protected harbor that appeared more like one hell of a garage for the ultra-rich than anything else. It tunneled through the Rocky Mountain and revealed an inner protected harbor. There was just enough room to turn the jet boat around and tie up against a wooden jetty that seemed oddly out of place. A single float plane was tied off at the end of the jetty. Sam pictured its pilot trying to build up enough speed through the channel-cum-tunnel before taking off into the Seymour Narrows. As a pilot, he couldn't imagine a worse place to try and take off or land, but whoever the pilot was had probably managed to do it a number of times. Above them, Sarah Reinhardt held a pistol to the back of the Secretary of Defense's head and said, "Sam Reilly, welcome to my fortress." Chapter 66, Ripple Rock Lookout. Genevieve set up the Barrett M107 sniper rifle. The weapon was a recoil-operated semi-automatic anti-materiel precision rifle developed by the American Barrett Firearms Manufacturing Company. Despite its designation as an anti-materiel rifle, it was used by some armed forces as an anti-personnel system. The M107 variant is also called the Light 50 for its .50 BMG chambering. This variant had a muzzle brake designed to accept a suppressor and made out of titanium instead of steel. She attached the suppressor. Beside her, Tom stared at the granite citadel through a pair of binoculars. She said, "How many have you got?" Tom said, "I count 8, plus Reinhardt and the Secretary of Defense." Genevieve nodded. "And that's why, when Sam Reilly says he's got things under control, we still need to come and save his ass." "I know," and that's why I listened to you." Genevieve got comfortable, lying in a prone shooting position. She brought the scope to her eye. They had a good view of the river and a reasonable view of the citadel. The river was 2,460 feet wide and had a depth of 330 feet. From their vantage point, the entire thing looked deadly. Some of those vortexes seemed to reach all the way to the bottom of those 330 feet. She scanned the citadel. There were 4 people on the main rampart, each with rifles. Another 2 on the tower at the back of the main castle wall, and 2 more guards who were heading toward the secured section that led down to the castle's private harbor. There was no way to tell how many others were still inside the building. She had a good visual on most of it, with the exception of the private harbor, in which she could only just see the tops of a float plane and Sam's Zodiac. She aimed toward the open space between the harbor and the main castle, a place that looked every bit like a miniaturized rolling grass lawn of an English manor. She began to prepare mentally for the kill shot. Snipers typically operate at ranges between 1,000 and 3,000 feet, and occasionally take an enemy out from much farther away. A Canadian Special Forces sniper, for instance, shattered the world record for longest confirmed kill shot in 2017, shooting an ISIS fighter dead in Iraq from over 2 miles away. Then again, Genevieve was a good marksperson, but a long way off from a professional sniper. The big question was, could Sam draw Reinhardt out into the open long enough for her to take a shot? Genevieve locked onto Sam and Dean, tracking their movements up toward the open green space. She drew a breath, because there in front of them she could see the Secretary of Defense and Sarah Reinhardt. She closed her left eye and exhaled slowly. The slightest of smiles crept across her lips, because she had a clear sight on Sarah Reinhardt. Chapter 67. Sam Reilly stepped off the Zodiac. He pointed his Glock at Godkin and gestured for the man to walk ahead. Godkin appeared to have his wrists bound behind his back. His hands appeared to be balled into angry fists surrounding something. Sarah Reinhardt held a pistol to the Secretary of Defense's head. She glanced at Sam, then at his prisoner, and smiled. "Mr. Reilly, it is so good to see a man who delivers as good as his word." "I try, ma'am." His eyes swept the compound, taking in the 2 security guards closest to them, each carrying submachine guns, the 6 shooters stationed on the rampart and tower, before finally landing on the Secretary of Defense. She was tall, with short-cropped, dark red hair. Despite her position, the hardened, bony features of her face betrayed no fear, and only the arrogant confidence of someone accustomed to power. She wore a suppressed grin and the regal air of a person who knew exactly how the next few minutes were going to play out. Sam said, "Madam Secretary." She suppressed a grin. "Sam, you took your time. I expected you an hour ago." "I'm sorry, ma'am. The Campbell River can be a tad challenging at times, but we'll have you out of here any minute." Reinhardt kept her arm around the secretary's neck, using her as a shield from any would-be snipers waiting on the opposite side of the Seymour Narrows. Her pistol, something old that looked like it belonged in a Dirty Harry movie with Clint Eastwood, aimed at the secretary's head. Behind them, the 2 guards looked edgy. This was probably the closest either of them had ever come to using their weapons. Sam kept his Glock leveled at Godkin. His eyes met Reinhardt. "So, how do you want to do this thing?" A simple exchange. Go on. Reinhardt shrugged. You send Godkin to me, and when he gets halfway, I'll send your Secretary of Defense. No. Why should I let you have the advantage? Why don't we send both prisoners across no man's land together? Do you play chess, Mr. Reilly? Sam smiled, taken aback by her strange segue. Excuse me? Chess. You know the little game children and kings alike have been playing for centuries? The one with the little horses, the king, the queen, some religious thingy. I know chess, Sam said, still holding his pistol aimed at Godkin. I just don't know what this has to do with a game. Well, in this analogy, I have the Secretary of Defense, a.k.a. the Queen, in chess. And you have a soldier, a mere pawn. Sam arched an eyebrow. You think your chess piece is worth more than mine. Bingo! Sam shrugged. All right, count of 3. I tell my chess piece to walk forward. When he gets to that midway point, you release the Secretary of Defense. Agreed? Agreed. Sam said, Off you go, Godkin. Godkin stepped forward, his hooded eyes somber, weary lines etched into his hard face, like a man resigned to death. At the midway point, Godkin stopped, his eyes fixed toward the rampart and tower. Sam said, Let the Secretary go, Reinhardt. I don't think so. Reinhardt turned her pistol toward him. It appears you carelessly no longer have anything to trade. Sam didn't wait for Reinhardt to take the first shot. He aimed for the guard closest to him and squeezed off 2 shots. The 9mm parabellums landed on his chest and neck. The guard fell to the ground and made no sign of getting up again. A third shot fired from the other side of the river, and the second guard died instantly. The sniper from the other side of the river now focused on the marksman on the ramparts. Shots rained down from the tower and the rampart. Sam dived to the ground and began returning fire. Godkin uncrossed his wrists, the small nylon band having never been attached. In his hands he gripped 2 grenades. He threw them one after the other. One landed on the ramparts closest to them, and the other inside the tower. 4, 3, 2, 1. The grenades exploded. The rampart shook violently, like an earthquake had taken hold of its weary foundations. Its granite walls shook and began to tumble, sending shards of splintered stone in all directions. The tower was tall and narrow, built for its noble looks instead of purpose, and the explosion was too much for it to take. The tower swayed backward and forward before giving out and crumbling down in an earth-shattering display of destruction. Reinhardt, like the best of gamblers, withdrew and regained control of the situation. She pushed the barrel of her pistol into the back of the secretary's head, holding her in close like a shield. Everyone stop! Sam and Godkin both aimed their handguns at Reinhardt. It might be possible to take her out, but the shot would be extremely difficult under the best of circumstances, and any mistake, and the secretary would get killed. Sam, keeping up with the whole chess analogy, said, What's the next move for a queen without the rest of her army? Reinhardt made a wry smile. Mr. Reilly, don't you realize the queen controls the whole board? Sam said, All right, so what are you going to do? Not me, you. Okay, go on. What am I going to do? Nothing. You and Godkin are going to wait, here. A queen can get to any point on the board she chooses. I choose to get on my float plane and get out of here. She leveled her gaze at Sam. If I see you or Godkin try and follow me, I'll kill the bitch. The secretary drew a breath, but there was no fear in her face. As with the rest of her life, She was the most valuable piece in the game. Everyone wanted to keep her alive. She was either a bargaining chip or a boss. Either way, they all needed her. With equanimity, she said, "Let us go, Sam." Sam lowered his head. "Yes, ma'am." He watched as Reinhardt and the secretary descended the stairs down to the float plane, below the line of sight of Genevieve's shot. She started the ignition. The little Cessna 172's propeller began to turn, quickly disappearing into a whir. Reinhardt threw off the mooring lines and powered up. A couple seconds later, Sam watched as the Cessna disappeared down through the tunnel and out into the Seymour Narrows. The float plane engine rose a pitch, and the little aircraft broke free from its earthly restraints, beginning to climb like the bald-headed eagles that soared nearby. Sam heard the report of several shots being fired. One, if not more, of the rounds struck the nose of the float plane, ripping the propeller from its engine cowling as a series of sparks flew from the nose of the aircraft. Reinhardt, proving herself to be a good pilot, dropped the nose to maintain airspeed and set up for an immediate landing. She pulled back, slowed her airspeed, and flared directly above the calmest section of the Seymour Narrows, her pontoons barely creating a splash. Without a propeller to maintain any forward movement, the float plane was at the mercy of the currents, and almost immediately it was caught and drawn toward the large maelstrom. Chapter 68. Sam and Godkin climbed onto the Zodiac, threw off the lines, and raced through the tunnel and out into the Seymour Narrows. The tide had now fully changed its course, and the river had turned deadlier. He looked at Godkin. "Can you see it?" Godkin's eyes narrowed. "Over there!" Sam squinted, then he saw it. The float plane, without a propeller, had begun to drift, and had been swept up into the violent current. It was being quickly drawn toward the largest maelstrom, the sort of thing that had sunk countless vessels over the years, not just small runabouts, but large ships, and even a ferry. For the float plane, delicately resting on its twin pontoons, the whirlpool would crush it in an instant, before swallowing it whole and digesting its remains in the rocky seabed far below. Godkin exchanged a glance with Sam. Without hesitation or thought of his own safety, he said, "Quick! You know what you have to do!" Sam pushed the throttles all the way forward, racing toward the maelstrom. The aircraft seemed to hang in there longer than he expected. Caught up in the current, the float plane drifted aimlessly in large circles, with each revolution being drawn closer to the eye of the vortex. On the outside of the float plane, both Reinhardt and the Secretary of Defense stood on the pontoons, gripping the wing arches for support. Reinhardt no longer appeared to be wielding a pistol at the Secretary. Given the likely outcome of the float plane trapped in the whirlpool, the win was probably moot. Sam threw all caution to the wind, and instead of trying to enter the outer edge of the maelstrom, he turned the Zodiac straight for the eye of the vortex and accelerated fully. Roxy whined as she skipped over the outer waves of the whirlpool before quickly becoming caught inside the narrowing eye at the center. One after the other, the float plane and the Zodiac spun around, slowly being sucked deeper into the vortex. The vertical walls of water now revealing a deadly cliff of some 30 feet of water above them. Sam knew it would be impossible for either vessel to climb out. After several loops around the spinning whirlpool, the vortex narrowed until both the float plane and the Zodiac locked together. Sam recalled the log he'd seen enter a small maelstrom earlier in the day, and pictured the water above closing in on them, sealing them like a giant mouth, 30 or more feet beneath the surface. A split second later, both vessels were drawn under, and the maelstrom closed up, burying them beneath more than 1,000,000 gallons of water. Chapter 69. The last thing Sam Reilly did before his world turned to darkness was grab hold of the rescue DPV, placing the first regulator he could get his hands on into his mouth. He pressed the start button, and the twin electric propellers whirred into life. Sam didn't have a mask on, and the entire environment appeared like an obtuse blur. He could make out shapes, and not much more. The Zodiac, ripped free from the dying maelstrom, disappeared downriver. The float plane tumbled along into the seemingly bottomless abyss. He opened the electric throttle and gripped the DPV with all his might, chasing after the sinking float plane. His ears hurt, indicating he was descending faster than he could naturally equalize the pressure in his ears. He had no idea how deep they had dropped, but nor did he care. There was nothing he could do about that. When he reached it, he realized that the secretary and Reinhardt were nowhere to be seen. Their bodies likely to have been knocked off and separated from the aircraft as the vortex dragged them under. He turned around and spotted Reinhardt as her body was flung helplessly around like a rag doll in a washing machine. Their eyes locked together for an instant, and Sam saw the abject terror in Reinhardt's face, and then she was gone. A split second later, the secretary came into view. Sam mentally calculated a projection between where the secretary was being dragged by the current and then aimed the DPV in a diagonal line toward her. The seconds passed slowly, but his mental calculations proved accurate. He grabbed hold of her waist with his left hand, locking in tight, to make sure he didn't lose her. With his right hand, he fed her the secondary regulator. The secretary didn't need any more help than that. She took the regulator, placed it in her mouth, and drew a deep breath. Sam turned the DPV upward. Roughly 10 feet from the surface, their air supply ran out. Sam held his breath and kicked hard as the DPV whined against the discombobulated current. They surfaced in the middle of the Seymour Narrows. It was a giant sea of disturbed water, and Sam doubted very much that they were going to make it out alive. Their energy was already spent. The DPV had nowhere near enough power to keep pulling them out of the entire river, and they were close to drowning. The secretary's head kept dipping underwater, her red hair cascading across her face. They were floating downriver. Sam spotted a small inlet that offered some shelter. It was roughly 50-50 that they would make it. If he failed, they would be caught up in the ocean rapids that formed around the point of the rocky outcrop. He pointed the DPV and told the secretary to hold on tight. Soon the water settled, and he motored all the way up to the jagged bank of the river. He helped the secretary climb out of the water. Safe out of the water, they both lay on their backs, barely enough energy to breathe. After a few minutes, the secretary rolled over and looked at Sam, her emerald green eyes meeting his. She smiled. "Sam." "Yes, ma'am." "Thank you for saving my life." "You're welcome." "I never doubted you would come through for me." She smiled magnanimously, giving him the briefest kiss on his lips. "This is exactly why I didn't want to lose you." "Thank you, ma'am," Sam said, glad to see that her near-death experience hadn't chipped her steely armor. "Sam." "Yes, ma'am." "Dean Godkin's dead, isn't he?" Sam thought back to the ghost of a man he'd seen out the corner of his eye, walking on the other side of the beach, heading north into Vancouver Island's great wilderness. He thought about the man who had traded his life and everything he knew for his country, for honor and duty, and even after being betrayed, had willingly sacrificed his own life to save the secretary's. Sam, she persisted, her voice suddenly crisp. He exhaled slowly. Godkin's dead, ma'am. No one, even hyped up on berserker drugs, could have survived being pulled into that vortex. She smiled. Very good. Then that's it. Everyone and everything involved in RX-16SF is now dead, and the entire project can be shelved for good. Sam said, As you wish, Madam Secretary. Chapter 70. Grosmorn, Canada, 4 weeks later. It took 485 million years for Mother Nature to create Grosmorn National Park, a place unlike any other on Earth. A UNESCO World Heritage Site, covering more than 1,000 square miles, the park is a never-ending series of wonders and delights and a demonstration of the spectacularly raw and enigmatic beauty of the physical world. The Tehillah entered the majestic fjord. On its deck, Sam took a reading of the sun using the sunstone and Uunartok disk. He exhaled slowly. A grin formed on his parted lips. Sati said, You look happy. I am. Sam handed her the ancient navigational device. Have a look at this. It's a perfect match. Sati shook her head in wonder. I can't believe we're tracking the same route these Vikings once took, all those centuries ago. It's quite something, isn't it? I'll say. Over the past 2 weeks, they had followed the locations marked on the Uunartok disk and the runic stone. It had taken the Tehillah from Greenland to Newfoundland, all the way south to Oak Island, a place that has been a subject for treasure hunters ever since the late 1700s, with rumors that Captain Kidd's treasure was buried there. While there was never much evidence to support what went on during the early excavations, stories began to be published and documented as early as 1856. Since that time, there have been many theories that extend beyond that of Captain Kidd, which include, among others, religious artifacts, manuscripts, and Marie Antoinette's jewels. The treasure has also been prone to criticism by those who have dismissed search areas as natural phenomena. Of course, now Sam could see that some of those natural phenomena may have been caused by Vikings who inhabited there for some time. Afterward, the Uunartok disk took them on a voyage to Lens aux Meadows, a French-English name which can be translated as the bay with the grasslands. From Lens aux Meadows, the Tehillah headed into the Atlantic. Somewhere along the way, something occurred to the original Viking ship, a storm or a disaster of some sort, that caused them to turn back. The markings on the Uunartok disk showed the longship must have been damaged, or that there was a severe and prolonged storm, because the Viking vessel kept changing its latitude before eventually entering the fjord at Grosmorn. Sati stared at the markings on the Uunartok disk. There was only one more marking, and it was close to the current one, indicating the final navigational sunstone reading was taken nearby. She paused. They never made it back to Lens aux Meadows. It doesn't look like it, Sam admitted. Since I've been reading up on it, there seems to be a lot of debate about the origins of Lens aux Meadows' name. Care to offer your opinion? Sure. It's fairly straightforward. Do tell, Sam said, a flicker of a smile on his lips. What? It's been researched to death. Go on. These things, in my experience, are rarely simple. She placed her hands akimbo. How the village itself came to be named Lens aux Meadows is debated. One possibility is that Lens aux Meadows is a corruption of the French designation Lens aux Meadows, which means jellyfish cove. The shift from meadows to meadows may have occurred because the landscape in the area tends to be open, with meadows. A more recent supposition is that it is derived from Lance à la Médée, or Medea's Cove, the name it bears on a 1862 French naval chart. Whether Medea or Medusa, it is possible that the name refers to a French naval vessel. When referring to the Medusa, you're sure it's about the French naval vessel? Sutty nodded. I'm just going off what I've read, but yeah, it's meant to be about the French naval vessel. Why? Sam said, And not the curse? What curse? There's a legend in Greek mythology about a snake-haired gorgon known as a Medusa, and if you stare into its eyes, the curse will turn you to stone. It's known as the Medusa's curse. She shook her head. No, I've never heard of that, and don't see how it could possibly relate to a 10th century Viking settlement in Newfoundland. Neither do I. It was just a thought. The Tehillah continued its journey. Soaring fjords and moody mountains towered high above them, concealing a diverse panorama of beaches and bogs, forests and barren cliffs. Shaped by colliding continents and grinding glaciers, Gros Morne's ancient landscape is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Sam stared at the spectacular vista. It's beautiful, isn't it? Sutty agreed, her eyes locked on the distant horizon. Do you know it was here where the theory of plate tectonics was confirmed? You can actually walk over ancient sea floor and preserved ocean avalanches. It's a distinctive red landscape of exposed Earth's mantle, thrust up by the collision of tectonic plates millions of years ago. No, I didn't realize that. It's true, she said, an impish grin forming on her lips. Want to guess the location of the only other place on Earth where you can hike on the mantle? Sam said, That would be Macquarie Island, somewhere roughly between the island of Tasmania and Antarctica, a distant part of Australia. Just one more unique thing shared between Canada and Australia. Sutty glanced at Sam, a wry smile on her intelligent face. You might be right there. We do tend to share a lot in common with Australia. A couple hours later, the Tehillah slowed to a stop. Sam checked and double-checked the markings on the sunstone and Unartok disk. There was no doubt about it. They were at the right place. His eyes swept the towering cliffs that line the water's edge. This was the last location the ancient Viking navigator marked on the Unartok disk. And yet there was nothing to be seen. Definitely no sign of Valhalla. Not on the surface, but possibly below. As with so many things when it came to scuba diving, it might be a completely different story underwater. Chapter 71. Sam, Tom, Genevieve, and Sutty all made the dive. They wore dry suits with thick woolen clothing underneath. A quick reconnaissance of the seabed below revealed a large landslide had dramatically changed the shape of the vertical cliff. Sam added some air to his BCD, finding his neutral buoyancy, as he explored the pile of rocky debris that now formed its own reef. They dived around the reef, trying to find any evidence of a means through. Sam began his ascent and stopped. At a depth of roughly 20 feet, two ginormous boulders rested upon each other, providing an opening just large enough to swim through. He switched on his flashlight, shining its beam into the dark abyss. The question remained, where did it go? Sam got the rest of his group's attention and signaled that he was going to go through. He slowly kicked his fins, working his way gently through the small opening, while trying his best not to stir the silt below. After 20 to 30 feet, the gap widened before opening completely. Sam waited for Sutty, Tom, and Genevieve to follow, and then slowly surfaced. His head broached the water. He gave a burst of air to inflate his BCD like a life jacket. The sound echoed in the darkness, like he was in a massive chamber. In the distance, a small beam of light radiated down from an opening high above. It lit up an island. They slowly swam toward the island. It was covered in strange plants, with leaves nearly 7 feet wide. They reminded him of something straight out of Jurassic Park, but he'd seen them once before, in a small grotto on Black Bear Island, Manitoba. Sutty said, "What is this place?" Sam looked distantly around the grotto. "If I had to guess, I'd say it's Valhalla, but not as the Viking sagas would have us imagine it. Their gods, Odin and Thor, were just Hellenistic warriors who had discovered a plant that produced seeds capable of being ground up and ingested to provide superhuman powers, and a tendency toward insanity that led to the name Berserkers, who were so prevalent in stories of ancient Viking lore. Epilogue. Sam Reilly read the final report from the Secretary of Defense. A U.S. and Canadian task force had raided Sarah Reinhardt's citadel on the outskirts of the Seymour Narrows shortly after the Secretary's near-death incident, shutting down a drug cartel known as the Berserkers. It revealed that Reinhardt, along with her family, had been harvesting the key ingredient in RX-16SF, aka the Berserker drug, from a Jurassic flower found only in a small grotto near Black Bear Island, Manitoba. The grotto had been secured under Canadian National Trust and protected so that botanists could study the unique flora. With the head of the cartel severed, the entire biker gang fell apart. Sam was about to shut down his laptop when another email came through and caught his eye. It had come from an auction house associated with Christie's and had the simple heading, "Are you interested in this?" He almost deleted it out of habit, assuming that it was merely an ad for something he wasn't interested in. But for whatever reason, he clicked the document open. The email revealed an image that took his breath away. It was an oil painting. The quality, along with the artist's skill, wasn't anything out of the ordinary. Not that Sam cared even a little about the artistic abilities of its painter. It was the subject of the painting and its location that suddenly caught his attention. It depicted a Spanish slave ship high on a river's bank. The location was marked as the Save River, Africa, and the date on the painting was 16th June, 1834. There was a single note from the auctioneer. "I've had the ship checked against historical records, and it appears to match that of the Spanish slave ship Midas. I just thought you might want to know. Regards, Edwin Young." Tom walked into the room and exchanged a glance with Sam. "Why do you have that grin on your face?" "Nothing. I just found something interesting, that's all." "Oh, yeah? Where are we headed?" Sam drew a breath. "Zimbabwe." "Really?" Tom asked. "What's in Zimbabwe?" "Hopefully the remains of a 360-ton Spanish slave ship named Midas." "Obviously." Tom's eyes narrowed. "And what is it about this ship that has you suddenly so animated?" Sam said, "Midas left Africa in April 1829 with a cargo of hundreds of African slaves. headed for the Americas. It was bound for the Caribbean, but it never made it. So? There must have been thousands of slave traders that never made it across the Atlantic. What makes this one of so much particular interest to you? You see, it's believed that the African slaves revolted against the Spanish traders somewhere along the arduous journey across the Atlantic. Apparently, it was a particularly hard journey, with one prolonged navigational detour after the next, leaving the Spanish as well as the African slaves to deteriorate. Tom smiled, starting to see what happened. The slaves took the ship? That's right. Not only did they take the ship, killing their Spanish slave traders in the process, but they didn't stop there. What do you mean? What did they do? They set about taking other ships, pirating the highly treasured Caribbean, as other ships, Spanish, English, French, Dutch, Portuguese, you name it, passed through their waters. They were getting rich off the very people who had enslaved them? Yes. They retook other slave ships, gaining momentum, along with gold and treasured artifacts. Tom's face was set with curiosity. So what happened to them? No one knows. Midas was last seen somewhere off the coast of Cuba on the 2nd of October, 1833. She was presumed sunk, her infinite treasures garnered from years of piracy lost forever. Until now? Yeah. Sam turned his laptop around so Tom could see the oil painting depicting the ship. This was painted in June 1834 along the Save River in modern-day Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe? Tom asked. What the hell was a slave trader turned pirate doing on that side of Africa? I mean, if they wanted to get home. They were a long way off course. Sam nodded. That, Tom, is exactly what we're heading to Zimbabwe to find out. The end. This has been Valhalla Found, Sam Reilly, Book 23. Written by Christopher Cartwright. Narrated by David Gilmore. Copyright 2021 by Christopher Cartwright. Production copyright 2021 by Christopher Cartwright. Thank you for listening.